Some crime scenes reveal truths so viscerally brutal that their raw documentation is permanently censored by the strict boundaries of this platform, forcing us to peer through the shadows of these heavily sanitized tragedies to find the calculated malice underneath. When the cold laws of physics, forensic evidence, and shattered bones utterly defy the frantic tears of a grieving partner, we are left to unravel the sinister deceptions of killers who swore to investigators that their victims simply slipped and fell. If you enjoy investigations, you can subscribe to the channel, and I will try to release interesting investigations as often as possible. Behind the sun-drenched facade of Winter Park, Florida, the shared apartment of Sarah Boone and George Torres Jr. functioned less as a sanctuary and more as a pressure cooker for a highly toxic, deeply co-dependent relationship characterized by cyclical violence and severe alcohol abuse. The couple shared a documented, extensive history of domestic disturbances, with local law enforcement having been dispatched to their residence on multiple occasions to intervene in physical altercations that often left both parties bruised and battered. George, despite being the victim in the ultimate tragedy, was caught in a destructive loop of returning to an environment where hostility was the baseline of their daily interactions, creating a volatile atmosphere where boundaries were non-existent and aggressive behavior was normalized. On the evening of February 23, 2020, the couple was confined to this charged environment, engaging in what Boone would later describe to authorities as a peaceful night of drinking Chardonnay, working on a jigsaw puzzle, and enjoying each other's company. According to the foundational timeline established by the initial investigation, the night supposedly transitioned from mundane domestic activities into an impromptu, adult game of hide and seek, a premise that entirely contradicted the grim reality of their established behavioral patterns. The apartment layout, cluttered and claustrophobic, provided the setting for this bizarre shift in dynamics where a vintage blue, hard-shell suitcase resting in the living room suddenly became the focal point of their evening. The narrative suggested that in a state of deep intoxication, the couple found the idea of George attempting to fit his adult frame into the confined luggage highly amusing, leading to a sequence of events where he voluntarily climbed inside to hide. This moment, painted by Boone as an innocent, drunken misadventure, marked the beginning of a prolonged and torturous confinement that would end with George taking his final, desperate breaths trapped within the suffocating darkness of the zipped canvas. The stark contrast between the purported lightheartedness of the evening and the grotesque nature of the eventual crime scene highlights the profound deception that often attempts to mask calculated domestic violence. Understanding the baseline toxicity of their shared life is crucial, as it fundamentally dismantles the notion that the horrific events of that night were merely a tragic anomaly born out of a harmless game between two loving partners. The devastating shift from a supposed domestic game to a confirmed fatality occurred the following afternoon, on February 24, when Boone initiated a frantic, yet strangely disjointed, 911 call to Orange County emergency dispatchers at approximately 100 p.m. Over the recorded line, Boone's voice carried a chilling mix of panic and detachment as she articulated an entirely implausible scenario, explaining to the operator that her boyfriend was dead inside a suitcase and that she did not know what had happened. She detailed her narrative, claiming that after zipping George inside the luggage for comedic effect, she decided to head upstairs to her bedroom, assuming he possessed the physical capability to simply unzip the suitcase from the inside and free himself. Boone insisted that she subsequently fell into a deep, alcohol-induced sleep, only to wake up late the next morning to an eerie silence in the apartment, which eventually prompted her to walk downstairs and check on the living room. Upon discovering the blue suitcase in the exact same position she had left it hours earlier, she claimed to have unzipped it to find George completely unresponsive, purple, and cold to the touch, prompting her delayed call to emergency services. When first responders breached the apartment, they were met with a scene that immediately contradicted the physics of an accidental entrapment. finding George's lifeless body contorted inside the luggage with clear signs that rigor mortis had already established itself, indicating he had been deceased for a significant portion of the night. The physical impossibility of a grown man failing to alert his partner, or failing to break out of standard luggage raised immediate, glaring red flags for the seasoned paramedics and responding patrol officers who secured the perimeter. George was pronounced dead at the scene, transforming the cluttered Winter Park living room from a site of a reported accident into an active, tightly controlled homicide investigation where every object, including the innocuous puzzle and the fatal blue suitcase, was preserved as evidence. The inciting incident of the 911 called us served not as a request for medical rescue, but as the deployment of a meticulously constructed, yet fundamentally flawed, alibi meant to preemptively explain away a murder. Investigators immediately recognized that the physics of the scene, the timeline of the delayed call, and the nature of the confinement were entirely irreconcilable with Boone's insistence that a tragic slip of judgment was the sole cause of death. As the formal investigation accelerated, the narrative of an innocent game rapidly deteriorated under the weight of meticulous forensic scrutiny and standard police procedure, replacing Boone's story with a much darker, forensic reality. Crime scene technicians meticulously documented the apartment, noting the precise resting place of the suitcase and analyzing it for signs of structural failure or internal damage that would suggest a violent, desperate struggle for survival. The medical examiner's preliminary findings dealt a catastrophic blow to the accident theory, revealing that George's body exhibited severe blunt force trauma, including a busted lip, bruising around his eye, and defensive wounds that indicated a physical altercation had taken place prior to or during his confinement. The autopsy ultimately concluded that the cause of death was a combination of positional asphyxia and the blunt force injuries, painting a horrific picture of a man who was beaten before being folded into an impossibly tight space where his lungs were slowly compressed until they failed. Detectives conducted extensive, recorded interviews with Boone, during which she maintained her defensive posture, repeatedly minimizing her culpability and firmly holding on to the assertion that she genuinely believed he could escape. However, the most critical turning point in the rising action occurred when investigators, following standard protocol for domestic death investigations, obtained a search warrant to execute a comprehensive forensic extraction of Boone's smartphone. The device was handed over to digital forensics experts who painstakingly bypassed its security measures, delving into the memory banks to recover deleted data, text messages, and media files that might provide a factual timeline of the crucial hours leading up to George's death. The agonizing wait for the digital extraction results allowed detectives to further build a profile of the couple's volatile history, pulling court records and previous police reports that established a clear, unassailable pattern of Boone's capacity for aggression. As the data from the phone was successfully parsed and reconstructed on police computers, investigators uncovered buried digital artifacts that fundamentally altered the trajectory of the case, shifting it from a suspicious death investigation into a clear-cut pursuit of a murder conviction. The gradual unearthing of these digital files represented the systematic dismantling of Boone's carefully rehearsed lies, proving that in the modern era of criminal investigation, a perpetrator's own technology often serves as the most objective and unforgiving witness to their crimes. The climax of the investigation materialized within the sterile, confined walls of an Orange County interrogation room, where detectives strategically presented Boone with the absolute destruction of her alibi. After allowing her to confidently reiterate her fabricated story of falling asleep while he was safely playing a game, the lead investigators fundamentally shifted the dynamic of the interview by placing a laptop on the table and hitting play on 2 recovered video files extracted directly from her own cell phone. The horrifying footage, recorded by Boone herself on the night of the murder, showed the blue suitcase resting on the living room floor, visibly bulging and violently shifting as George frantically fought for his life from within the canvas confines. The audio captured from the recording was overwhelmingly damning, featuring George desperately yelling, "Sarah, I can't breathe. Seriously," as he kicked against the internal frame of the luggage in a futile attempt to expand his oxygen supply, instead of rushing to assist him. Boone's voice echoed clearly from behind the camera lens, filled with cold, mocking laughter as she taunted his suffering with calculated cruelty, stating, "That's what I feel like when you cheat on me." As George continued to beg for his life, expressing his genuine terror, Boone coldly responded, "That's on you," entirely disregarding his physical agony and continuing to document his torture as a twisted form of punitive retaliation. The sheer horror of the interrogation room confrontation lay in the irrefutable proof that Boone had stood over him, fully conscious and aware of his impending death, using her smartphone not to call for help, but to capture his final, agonizing moments. Faced with the stark, high-definition reality of her own actions played back to her, Boone's facade entirely collapsed. Her previous assertions of an innocent game and a tragic accident evaporated into silence as she stared at the undeniable evidence of her own malice. This climax represented the ultimate triumph of objective digital forensics over manipulative human deception, proving beyond any shadow of a doubt that the confinement was a deliberate act of torture culminating in a premeditated murder. The video served as a chilling testament to the banality of evil, demonstrating how a mundane household object and a personal device could be weaponized to execute and document a horrifically slow and calculated execution. Following the overwhelming revelation of the video evidence, Sarah Boone was immediately formally arrested and charged with second-degree murder, thrusting the case into a highly publicized and agonizingly protracted legal saga. The objective reality of the judicial process over the subsequent years became a circus of delays, characterized by Boone's continuous, combative cycling through a multitude of court-appointed defense attorneys, repeatedly claiming irreconcilable differences and inadequate representation. This legal strategy, whether intentional or a byproduct of her difficult nature, resulted in years of postponed trial dates, effectively stalling the final delivery of justice and forcing the victim's family to endure a seemingly endless state of legal purgatory. The suitcase itself, alongside the harrowing smartphone footage, remains locked in the state's evidence vault, serving as a grim, physical anchor to a trial that continues to test the patience of the Florida judicial system. George Torres Jr.'s death was officially categorized as a brutal homicide, his tragic end permanently recorded in the annals of criminal history as a stark warning about the lethal potential hidden behind closed apartment doors. The conclusion of this investigation solidifies the forensic truth that human bodies do not simply succumb to bizarre accidents without leaving a verifiable trail of physics and trauma that investigators can decode. The case of the blue suitcase stands as a chilling monument to the dark realities of domestic confinement, proving that the most claustrophobic and dangerous spaces are often found within the supposed safety of one's own living room. As we leave behind the suffocating atmosphere of this Florida apartment, we must shift our focus to another seemingly safe domestic environment, where a spouse desperately attempted to disguise a violent reality as a mundane mishap. Moving from the living room to the sterile, porcelain confines of a suburban bathroom, we encounter another grieving partner, making a frantic emergency call, swearing that the fatal circumstances they just discovered were nothing more than a tragic, accidental slip in the water. The facade of the American dream was meticulously maintained in Hamilton Township, Ohio, where the recently married couple, Ryan and Sarah Widmer, projected an image of absolute suburban bliss to their friends, family, and unsuspecting neighbors. Sarah, an outwardly healthy, vibrant, and deeply loved 24-year-old dental hygienist, and Ryan, an ambitious professional working in sports management, had recently purchased a pristine 4-bedroom home that served as the ultimate symbol of their newly minted adult lives together. To the outside world, their existence was a carefully curated portrait of domestic tranquility, seemingly devoid of any visible red flags, financial ruin, or documented marital strife that typically precedes a violent and catastrophic rupture within a household. Behind the manicured lawn and the quiet cul-de-sac, however, The absolute truth of their private dynamic remained securely sealed away from public scrutiny, masking whatever subtle frictions, hidden psychological fractures, or brewing resentments existed beneath the polished surface of their 4-month marriage. The mundane routines of their daily life, characterized by regular work schedules, mundane household chores, and quiet evenings spent relaxing in front of the television, offered absolutely no predictive indicators of the horrific, intimate violence that was about to unfold within the supposedly safe confines of their master bathroom. On the evening of August 11, 2008, the couple returned to their quiet suburban sanctuary after a completely ordinary day, transitioning into their typical nighttime routines while the surrounding neighborhood settled into a peaceful, deeply ordinary silence. Sarah, seeking a moment of solitary relaxation after her workday, retreated to the master bathroom to take a warm bath, a completely innocuous and common activity that would inexplicably transform into the epicenter of one of the most polarizing and heavily scrutinized murder investigations in Ohio judicial history. It is within these deeply familiar, highly intimate, and utterly ordinary domestic spaces that the most chilling acts of interpersonal violence often occur, leveraging the assumed safety of the home environment to conceal the brutal reality of a sudden and fatal betrayal by a trusted partner. Understanding the perceived perfection of their life is absolutely vital, as it highlights the jarring and terrifying dissonance between the public facade of a happy, newlywed marriage and the catastrophic lethality that can spontaneously erupt behind locked doors, leaving an entire community grasping for a rational explanation where none truly exists. The quiet evening in their pristine home was simply the stage being set for a brutal encounter that would permanently shatter the illusion of their perfect life, replacing their suburban dream with a grim, meticulously analyzed crime scene. The illusion of suburban peace was violently and permanently shattered late that Monday evening when Ryan Widmer initiated a frantic, hysterical 911 call to Warren County emergency dispatchers, breathlessly declaring that he had just found his young wife face down and completely unresponsive in the bathtub. Throughout the agonizingly tense audio recording, Ryan's voice projected a state of sheer panic as he frantically informed the operator that Sarah had inexplicably fallen asleep under the water, claiming that he had just dragged her lifeless, heavy body from the tub to the carpet floor of their master bedroom to administer desperate, life-saving CPR. He continuously pleaded for an ambulance to be dispatched immediately, painting a chaotic, adrenaline-fueled mental image of a husband frantically fighting to save his beloved wife from a tragic, completely unforeseen aquatic accident that had silently claimed her life while he was watching television downstairs. When the first wave of emergency medical technicians and local police officers rapidly breached the front door and rushed up the stairs to the master suite, they were immediately confronted with a physical environment that profoundly contradicted the frantic, soaking, wet narrative Ryan had just established over the emergency telephone line. The seasoned first responders, highly trained to intuitively assess the chaotic, water-logged aftermath of a drowning rescue, instantly noted glaring anomalies that simply did not align with the basic physics of pulling a soaking wet, dead-weight human body out of a filled bathtub in a moment of pure terror. The floor of the bathroom, which should have been slick and completely saturated with standing water, displaced by the violent extraction of a drowning victim, was inexplicably bone dry, completely lacking the chaotic, splashing patterns inherent to a desperate rescue operation. Furthermore, the first officer on the scene made the crucial, highly damning observation that Sarah's naked body, supposedly fully submerged just moments prior, was essentially dry to the touch, with only her hair appearing slightly damp, while the surrounding carpet, where Ryan claimed to have been furiously pumping her chest, showed absolutely no signs of heavy water absorption. This initial encounter fundamentally shifted the entire trajectory of the night, transforming a tragic medical emergency call into a highly suspicious death investigation. As the physical reality of the sterile bathroom stood in stark, irrefutable defiance of Ryan Widmer's insistence that his wife had simply slipped beneath the surface. The inciting incident was not merely the tragic discovery of a body, but the immediate, chilling realization by first responders that the grieving husband's desperate tale of an accidental drowning was a poorly constructed illusion, mathematically and physically incompatible with the untouched environment they had just entered. This fundamental disconnect between Ryan's frantic auditory performance on the 911 call and the objective, dry reality of the master suite laid the immediate groundwork for a massive homicide investigation that would seek to uncover exactly how Sarah Widmer truly died. As the initial suspicion crystallized into a full-scale, aggressive homicide investigation, detectives began to methodically dismantle the mechanics of the supposed accident, revealing a trail of forensic inconsistencies that pointed directly to a violent struggle rather than a peaceful, watery slumber. The subsequent autopsy conducted by the county coroner dealt a devastating, fatal blow to the accident theory, revealing a constellation of deep internal bruising on Sarah's neck, a severe laceration on her scalp, and contusions on her upper body that were entirely consistent with a violent, forceful struggle, rather than the peaceful, painless passing of someone who had simply nodded off in a warm bath. Investigators meticulously documented the master bathroom, discovering that the tub itself was completely clean, lacking any water rings, soap scum, or the chaotic displacement of toiletries that would inevitably accompany a drowning person's desperate thrashing and the subsequent frantic retrieval of their body by a panicked spouse. The legal battle that ensued became an agonizing, unprecedented marathon of judicial endurance, transforming the Widmer case into a massive, multi-year spectacle that heavily divided the local community, dominated regional news cycles, and uniquely required 3 separate criminal trials to ultimately resolve. The first trial concluded with a swift guilty verdict, but this initial victory for the prosecution was controversially overturned and completely voided due to shocking jury misconduct. After it was discovered that jurors had conducted their own unauthorized, drying experiments in their home bathtubs to test the forensic timeline presented in court. This catastrophic legal setback forced the state to retry the entire complex case, plunging Sarah's grieving family back into the deeply traumatic ordeal of reliving the horrific medical testimonies, only for the second trial to end in a deeply frustrating hung jury that could not reach a unanimous consensus on the circumstantial evidence. Throughout this exhaustive, highly publicized legal circus, Ryan Widmer remained steadfast in his public assertions of total innocence, leveraging high-powered defense attorneys who aggressively attacked the coroner's findings, proposing alternative medical theories such as an undiagnosed neurological condition or a sudden, catastrophic cardiac event that supposedly caused her to collapse into the water. Despite these aggressive defense strategies, the prosecution relentlessly focused on the immovable, objective facts of the crime scene, continuously highlighting the sheer physical impossibility of pulling a drowned woman from a filled tub without soaking the surrounding environment, leaving distinct water trails, or dampening the carpet where life-saving measures were allegedly performed. The gradual accumulation of these forensic anomalies systematically eroded the defense's narrative, building a formidable mountain of circumstantial and physical evidence that fundamentally proved the bathroom scene had been meticulously, albeit clumsily, staged after a lethal physical altercation had already occurred elsewhere in the home. The absolute peak of tension and the definitive resolution of the forensic debate finally materialized during the unprecedented third murder trial in 2011, where the prosecution presented an overwhelming, impenetrable wall of specialized medical and crime scene reconstruction expertise. The climax of this final judicial showdown occurred when the state called upon renowned forensic pathologists to systematically deconstruct the profound physical trauma inflicted upon Sarah's body, definitively proving that the specific constellation of injuries could not have been sustained by a simple, accidental fall against the smooth, porcelain fixtures of a standard bathtub. The expert medical testimony painstakingly detailed how the deep muscle hemorrhaging, located deep within Sarah's neck, was the undeniable hallmark of a violent, forceful compression, indicating that she was brutally held down or strangled before she was ever introduced to the water, fundamentally obliterating the defense's theory of a sudden, spontaneous medical collapse. The prosecution masterfully utilized advanced crime scene reconstruction techniques to demonstrate the sheer absurdity of Ryan's timeline, proving beyond any reasonable doubt that a human body cannot be submerged, violently extracted, and subjected to aggressive resuscitation efforts without leaving a massive, undeniable liquid footprint across the entire bathroom and bedroom flooring. Furthermore, a crucial, highly damning piece of testimony came from a former cellmate of Ryan Widmer, who took the witness stand to recount a chilling, supposedly confidential conversation in which Widmer allegedly confessed to the murder, admitting that he had violently snapped during a domestic argument and drowned his wife in a fit of uncontrollable rage. While jailhouse informants are inherently subjected to heavy scrutiny, this specific testimony, when rigidly combined with the absolute physical impossibility of the dry crime scene and the severe blunt force trauma documented in the autopsy photographs, created an inescapable trap of guilt that the defense could no longer circumvent with theoretical medical anomalies. The jury in the third trial was finally presented with a cohesive, undeniable narrative where the cold, hard laws of fluid dynamics and forensic pathology completely silenced the frantic, tearful denials of the defendant, stripping away the carefully constructed facade of the grieving widower to reveal a calculated, violent killer. The major turning point was the realization that Ryan had likely killed Sarah in another location or at an earlier time, subsequently placing her body in the tub and draining it to stage the scene, failing to account for the simple, elemental fact that water inevitably leaves an indelible mark on its environment. This climax represented the ultimate triumph of methodical, scientifically grounded investigation over a frantic, improvised cover-up, proving that the absence of evidence, in this case, the absolute absence of displaced water, can ironically serve as the most deafening and damning evidence of all. Following the total exhaustion of all plausible defense theories and the overwhelming weight of the objective forensic reality, the jury in the third trial delivered a decisive, final verdict of guilty, definitively concluding one of the longest and most emotionally draining legal sagas in the history of Ohio's judicial system. Ryan Widmer was formally convicted of the brutal murder of his wife and was subsequently handed a severe sentence of 15 years to life in a state penitentiary, a ruling that finally provided a measure of grim justice for Sarah's devastated family after years of agonizing legal limbo and endless court appearances. Despite relentless, ongoing efforts by his appellate team to challenge the forensic findings and overturn the conviction based on alleged procedural errors or new scientific interpretations, the higher courts have consistently upheld the jury's decision, cementing the reality that the physical evidence of that night remains completely unassailable. The perfectly manicured suburban home, once a glowing symbol of the couple's bright future together, was permanently stained by the horrifying revelation of the intimate violence that occurred within its walls, serving as a dark monument to the fact that the most profound betrayals often hide behind the most ordinary, welcoming facades. Sarah Widmer's tragic death remains a foundational case study in forensic academies across the country, actively utilized to meticulously train future crime scene investigators on the critical importance of observing what is fundamentally missing from a staged environment, rather than solely focusing on what the perpetrator has actively placed there to be found. The conclusion of this exhausting domestic tragedy firmly anchors our understanding that while a killer may attempt to aggressively rewrite history through frantic emergency calls and artificially staged scenarios, the silent, objective truths etched into the human body and the physical environment will ultimately speak louder than any fabricated alibi. As we inevitably transition away from the suffocating, claustrophobic confines of staged domestic drowning incidents within suburban walls, we must now dramatically expand our focus to the vast, seemingly uncontrollable expanse of the natural world, where cunning perpetrators attempt to use the inherent dangers of the wild to mask their premeditated malice, leaving the sterile porcelain of the Ohio bathroom far behind. We turn our attention to the jagged, unforgiving cliffs of the remote American wilderness, where another grieving husband desperately tried to convince seasoned park authorities that a lethal, terrifying plunge was nothing more than a tragic misstep on a romantic anniversary hike. The pristine, carefully constructed image of Harold Henthorne presented to the affluent suburbs of Denver, Colorado, was that of a highly successful, intensely driven entrepreneur who supposedly dedicated his life to raising massive sums of capital for prestigious non-profit organizations and charitable causes. His marriage to Dr. Toni Henthorne, a brilliant, deeply respected, and highly compensated ophthalmologist who had relocated from Mississippi, appeared to the outside world as a harmonious union of two dedicated professionals thriving in their respective, lucrative fields. However, the absolute reality of Harold's existence was a meticulously maintained, completely fabricated mirage built on profound financial parasitism and a terrifying, unseen foundation of intense psychological control over his brilliant spouse. Behind the closed doors of their upscale home, Harold systematically isolated Toni from her tight-knit family and loyal friends, controlling every aspect of their household finances, actively monitoring her private communications, and strictly managing her schedule to ensure his absolute dominance over her daily life. Every single morning, he would dress in professional business attire, kiss his wife goodbye, and drive off to his supposed high-level executive meetings, maintaining the illusion of a dedicated breadwinner, while actually spending his days wandering shopping malls, eating at restaurants, and managing his complex web of lies. This elaborate, decades-long charade was heavily funded by the secret, deeply sinister reality that Harold possessed absolutely no legitimate source of income, entirely lacking a business, clients, or any verifiable employment history since the early years of his adulthood. Instead, his lavish lifestyle and his facade of extreme wealth were secretly bankrolled by the massive life insurance payout he received following the highly suspicious death of his first wife, combined with his total, unchecked access to Toni's substantial medical salary. Understanding the sheer depth of this calculated, psychopathic deception is absolutely crucial, as it clearly establishes Harold not as a loving partner caught in a sudden tragedy, but as a cold, methodical predator who viewed marriage strictly as a highly profitable, ultimately disposable financial enterprise. The supposedly perfect life they shared was nothing more than a carefully curated holding pattern, a quiet period of psychological entrapment that was destined to end the moment Harold decided that liquidating his primary asset was more beneficial than continuing his elaborate daily performance. The grim exposition of this parasitic relationship definitively sets the stage for a deadly anniversary trip that was marketed as a romantic, spontaneous gesture, but was, in forensic reality, the execution phase of a long-planned, deeply sinister financial transaction. The meticulously maintained facade reached its lethal, catastrophic breaking point on the crisp afternoon of September 29, 2012, when Harold escorted Toni to the rugged, unforgiving, and deeply isolated terrain of Rocky Mountain National Park to allegedly celebrate their 12th wedding anniversary. The supposed romantic excursion deliberately deviated from the established, heavily trafficked tourist trails, pushing deep into the treacherous, jagged outcroppings and steep cliffs of Deer Mountain, a remote, dangerous area far removed from the safety and visibility of typical park visitors or vigilant rangers. The inciting incident that forever altered the trajectory of both their lives occurred when Harold initiated a frantic, seemingly desperate call to emergency dispatchers, breathlessly claiming that his wife had tragically lost her footing and plummeted nearly 130 feet off a sheer cliff face while attempting to capture a scenic photograph. First responders, highly trained mountaineers, and federal park rangers rapidly mobilized, rushing to the incredibly remote and highly dangerous location, undertaking a perilous, physically exhausting rescue operation over treacherous terrain. Upon finally reaching the base of the massive drop, they were immediately confronted with a horrific scene. They found Toni's broken body resting among the rocks, her physical injuries far too catastrophic and severe for any medical intervention or resuscitation efforts to be remotely viable. Harold's immediate narrative, delivered to the responding rangers with a chilling mix of panic and specific detail, framed the catastrophic event as a pure, unpredictable accident, a momentary, tragic lapse in balance on loose gravel that instantly shattered their anniversary celebration and left him a devastated, grieving widower. This emergency call, and the subsequent grim discovery of the body served as the definitive, undeniable point of no return, instantly transforming a picturesque wilderness excursion into an active, highly scrutinized federal death investigation. The sheer isolation of the fatal drop, combined with Harold's status as the sole, uncorroborated witness to the event, immediately raised subtle red flags for the seasoned park investigators who are intimately familiar with the distinct differences between genuine wilderness accidents and staged fatalities. The inciting incident was not merely the tragic fall itself, but the deployment of Harold's carefully rehearsed alibi, a story specifically designed to leverage the inherent, unpredictable dangers of the natural world to completely mask a calculated, violent homicide from the authorities. This fundamental disconnect between the majestic beauty of the national park and the brutal, violent reality of a shattered human body laid the immediate groundwork for an investigation that would soon expose the terrifying depths of Harold Henthorne's lifelong deception. As National Park Service investigators and federal agents from the FBI began to meticulously reconstruct the events leading up to the fatal plunge, the facade of the grieving husband rapidly disintegrated under the crushing weight of his own profound inconsistencies and a trail of glaring physical evidence. Harold's constantly shifting narrative provided the first major, undeniable red flags for detectives. He initially claimed to investigators that he was looking down at his phone, specifically reading a text message, when he heard Toni fall, but later completely altered his story, stating he actually saw a blur of her falling while he was looking directly at her. He repeatedly changed critical details regarding the distance between them, the specific mechanics of the supposed slip, and the exact sequence of events, creating a chaotic, contradictory timeline that completely defied the logic of a traumatized, but truthful witness. The federal investigation took a highly sinister and definitively damning turn when detectives executed a search warrant on Harold's vehicle and discovered a heavily annotated, highly detailed park map featuring a chilling, hand-drawn X, marking the exact, incredibly remote location where Toni had plummeted to her death. This undeniable piece of physical evidence strongly suggested an extensive, highly premeditated scouting of the fatal drop zone, completely destroying the narrative that their route was a spontaneous, romantic detour taken on a whim. This discovery prompted a massive deep dive background investigation into Harold's past, leading federal agents to uncover the horrifying, previously closed case of his first wife, Lynn Henthorne, who had died in a bizarre, incredibly suspicious accident 17 years prior. Investigators learned that Lynn had been fatally crushed on a remote highway late at night, when a Jeep, elevated on a jack while Harold was supposedly changing a tire, inexplicably slipped and fell directly onto her, an event where Harold was, once again, the sole surviving witness. The parallel circumstances were absolutely impossible for seasoned detectives to ignore, especially when deep forensic accounting revealed that in both fatal incidents, the immediate aftermath resulted in massive, multi-million-dollar life insurance payouts directly into Harold's personal bank accounts. Furthermore, the financial investigation absolutely decimated his professional persona, definitively proving that he had not held a legitimate job or earned a single, verifiable paycheck in over 2 decades, instead funding his lavish, deceptive lifestyle entirely through the death benefits of his first wife and the ongoing exploitation of his second. The rising action was a methodical, deeply disturbing unearthing of a serial black widow, revealing a cold, calculating predator who spent years meticulously planning the financial exploitation and eventual execution of the women who loved him, completely dismantling his carefully crafted illusion of the tragic, unlucky outdoorsman. The absolute peak of tension and the definitive, deeply satisfying dismantling of Harold Henthorne's lifelong deception unfolded in a highly charged federal courtroom in Denver, where prosecutors presented an impenetrable, overwhelming mountain of circumstantial, physical, and financial evidence. The trial's climax centered on the breathtakingly detailed, highly technical forensic reconstruction of the cliffside crime scene, utilizing advanced spatial mapping, physics, and expert testimony to unequivocally prove that the specific trajectory and resting place of Toni's body were physically incompatible with a simple, accidental slip from the ledge. Renowned biomechanical experts meticulously demonstrated to the jury that for Tony's body to have cleared the jagged outcroppings directly below the ledge and landed exactly where it did, she had to have been violently, forcefully pushed or thrown with significant, forward momentum by another person. This objective, scientifically grounded testimony completely obliterated Harold's frantic narrative of a clumsy misstep while adjusting a camera, proving beyond a reasonable doubt that the cold laws of physics simply did not support his fabricated version of events. The prosecution further devastated the defense by introducing chilling, irrefutable cell phone data that proved Harold had covertly visited the exact remote site of the murder 9 separate times in the weeks immediately preceding the anniversary hike. This digital footprint established an undeniable, terrifying pattern of premeditated location scouting, showing a killer actively measuring the lethality of a drop and preparing a secluded execution site far away from the prying eyes of the public. The jury was confronted with the overwhelming, inescapable reality of a man who had not only fabricated his entire identity, career, and financial standing, but who had literally hunted his wife in the wilderness, leading her to a pre-selected, thoroughly researched execution site under the guise of romantic celebration. When the defense finally rested their case, having failed to counter the crushing weight of the scientific and digital evidence, the courtroom was left grappling with the sheer, sociopathic calculation of a predator who viewed the majestic cliffs of a national park not as a scenic wonder, but as a convenient, untraceable weapon. This climax represented the total, irreversible collapse of his meticulously constructed false reality, replacing the highly curated image of a tragic widower with the horrifying, undeniable truth of a calculated, repeat murderer who weaponized the isolation of the natural world to execute a multi-million-dollar insurance fraud. Faced with an overwhelming, deeply cohesive cascade of forensic proof, expert biomechanical testimony, and his own heavily documented history of financial deceit, the federal jury swiftly delivered a resounding, unanimous guilty verdict, convicting Harold Henthorne of first-degree murder for the death of Dr. Tony Henthorne. The federal judge, acknowledging the sheer brutality and calculation of the crime, handed down a mandatory sentence of life in federal prison without the possibility of parole, ensuring that the man who had spent his entire adult life successfully masquerading as a grieving victim would die in absolute, highly monitored captivity. While he was officially tried and convicted strictly for Tony's murder, the incredibly public and detailed exposure of his methodology during the trial brought a delayed, grim sense of vindication and closure to the long-suffering family of his first wife, Lynn, permanently shifting the historical narrative of her deeply suspicious, supposedly accidental demise. Tony's tragic death remains a chilling, stark reminder for law enforcement regarding the critical importance of thoroughly investigating remote wilderness fatalities, fundamentally changing how park rangers and federal agents approach supposed recreational accidents that leave behind a sole surviving witness and a massive financial motive. The Henthorne case stands as a terrifying, historical testament to the extreme lengths a truly psychopathic individual will go to maintain a parasitic, fabricated lifestyle. It's proving that even the most majestic, awe-inspiring natural landscapes can be twisted into a stage for absolute, premeditated malice. The physical evidence recovered from the cliffside, paired with the digital breadcrumbs of his scouting trips, permanently dismantled the illusion that a fatal fall in the woods is always a tragedy of circumstance. As we depart the cold, jagged cliffs of the Colorado wilderness, leaving the treacherous heights of the national park behind, we must trace our analytical path back to the deceptive, enclosed safety of the domestic sphere. We are forced to examine another high-profile case where a man utilized a history of authority and a sterile household fixture to execute a remarkably similar, deeply controversial illusion of an accidental death. Moving from a fatal plunge in a remote forest to another completely dry bathtub in a suburban home, we will now analyze a highly publicized, deeply arrogant perpetrator who genuinely believed his police badge and his local charm could permanently mask the brutal reality of a violently staged aquatic homicide. The suburban landscape of Bolingbrook, Illinois, served as the personal fiefdom for Drew Peterson, a veteran police sergeant whose decades of law enforcement experience provided him with an intimate, highly weaponized knowledge of the criminal justice system and the mechanics of a homicide investigation. His professional authority within the local community was absolute, projecting an aura of untouchability that heavily insulated his deeply chaotic, deeply abusive personal life from any meaningful external scrutiny or internal department discipline. This dangerous power dynamic was most intensely focused on his highly contentious, bitterly acrimonious divorce from his third wife, Kathleen Savio, a woman who found herself trapped in an escalating nightmare of psychological torment and physical intimidation. The dissolution of their marriage was not a standard legal separation, but rather a protracted, brutal campaign of harassment, characterized by constant threats, aggressive surveillance, and Peterson's terrifying assertion that he could kill her and completely orchestrate a flawless cover-up. Kathleen lived in a state of perpetual, agonizing terror, repeatedly documenting her profound fears through frantic letters to the state's attorney, desperate pleas to her family, and official police reports that were systematically ignored or minimized by Peterson's loyal colleagues in uniform. She explicitly warned her loved ones that if she were ever found dead, they should immediately disregard any official narrative of an accident, firmly pointing the finger at her estranged husband as her inevitable murderer. Despite the overwhelming volume of her documented cries for help, the systemic failure of the local authorities to intervene created an isolated, heavily fortified environment where Peterson was effectively granted a horrifying license to operate with total impunity. He aggressively utilized his badge not as a shield to protect the innocent, but as a potent instrument of domestic terror, actively manipulating the legal system to drain Kathleen financially and exhaust her psychologically as their final divorce settlement approached. Understanding the sheer weight of this institutional betrayal is fundamentally crucial, as it completely reframes the impending tragedy not as a sudden, unpredictable domestic dispute, but as the calculated, inevitable execution of a woman who was systematically abandoned by the very people sworn to protect her. Suffocating atmosphere surrounding their separation perfectly set the stage for a staged fatality that would successfully exploit the inherent biases of the local police force, allowing a seasoned investigator to literally write his own exoneration. The terrifying prophecies meticulously documented by Kathleen Savio materialized into a grim, horrifying reality on the cold weekend of March 1, 2004, when concerned neighbors, acting on the desperate requests of her family, who had not heard from her for days, forced entry into her quiet Bolingbrook home. The local authorities were immediately dispatched to the residence, navigating through the perfectly orderly, undisturbed house until they reached the upstairs master bathroom, where they made a discovery that would plunge the community into a decades-long pursuit of justice. Kathleen was found deceased, her battered body resting in the completely dry, oval-shaped bathtub, her dark hair heavily matted with dried blood originating from a massive, gaping laceration located on the back of her head. Despite the inherently suspicious nature of the scene, including the absolute lack of standing water, the unusual positioning of her limbs, and the highly publicized, deeply violent history of her ongoing divorce from a powerful local police officer, the initial response from law enforcement was shockingly, almost criminally, negligent. The Bolingbrook Police Department, populated by Peterson's immediate peers and subordinates, rapidly seized control of the scene, actively treating the pristine, dry bathroom not as a highly compromised, active homicide investigation, but as the unfortunate site of a routine household accident. First responders and initial investigators entirely bypassed standard forensic protocols, failing to properly secure the perimeter, neglected to collect crucial biological evidence, and readily accepted the mathematically improbable theory that Kathleen had simply slipped, struck her head on the porcelain, and drowned before the water magically drained away. This catastrophic failure of investigative integrity culminated in a highly controversial coroner's inquest, heavily influenced by Peterson's overbearing presence and the institutional bias of his department, which officially rubber-stamped the cause of death as an accidental drowning. The inciting incident was thus not merely the tragic discovery of Kathleen's battered body, but the immediate, systemic cover-up executed by a deeply flawed police force that allowed one of their own to walk away entirely unscrutinized. This official declaration of an accident slammed the door shut on any meaningful pursuit of the truth, leaving her devastated family completely paralyzed by a corrupted justice system, and allowing Peterson to seamlessly transition into his next marriage without facing a single consequence. It established a chilling precedent that a badge could effectively function as a license to kill, burying the objective physical evidence beneath a mountain of professional courtesy and engineered investigative incompetence. The heavily fortified, completely fraudulent narrative surrounding Kathleen's death remained securely unchallenged for over 3 years, until the meticulously constructed facade of Drew Peterson's life spectacularly imploded with the sudden, highly suspicious disappearance of his young, fourth wife, Stacey Peterson, October 2007. Stacey's vanishing completely shattered the quiet complacency of Bolingbrook, instantly igniting an unprecedented, massive national media firestorm that placed every single aspect of Peterson's dark, violent marital history under the blinding, unforgiving spotlight of intense public and federal scrutiny. As legions of reporters, investigative journalists, and high-level state police descended upon the suburban town, the glaring, horrifying parallels between his estranged wives became absolutely impossible to ignore, forcing a complete, systemic re-evaluation of the closed case file regarding Kathleen Savio. The sheer volume of public outrage and the undeniable, terrifying pattern of domestic destruction compelled the local prosecutor's office, operating entirely independently of the compromised Bolingbrook Police Department, to finally take decisive aggressive action. Authorities formally petitioned the courts to order the exhumation of Kathleen Savio's remains, recognizing that the only way to pierce the veil of institutional corruption was to subject her body to the rigorous, unbiased scrutiny of independent, world-renowned forensic pathologists. When the casket was finally raised from the earth, it represented a profound, literal unearthing of a buried truth, transferring the physical evidence away from the corrupted hands of local law enforcement and into the sterile, deeply objective environment of a modern medical examiner's laboratory. The subsequent independent investigation meticulously reviewed the highly flawed original crime scene photographs, revealing massive, undeniable contradictions, such as the clear presence of a soaking wet towel ominously discarded on the edge of the perfectly dry tub, suggesting a frantic, messy cleanup. The rising action was characterized by this aggressive, scientific dismantling of the initial accident theory, methodically peeling back the layers of professional courtesy and investigative negligence to expose the raw, brutal reality of a staged crime scene. The entire nation watched in captivated horror as the impenetrable armor of a smug, arrogant police officer was systematically stripped away by the unrelenting persistence of forensic science and the undeniable, lingering echoes of the victims he believed he had permanently silenced. The absolute peak of tension and the definitive destruction of Drew Peterson's carefully orchestrated alibi arrived with the shocking, deeply damning results of the second, highly specialized autopsy performed by renowned forensic pathologist Dr. Michael Baden. The comprehensive medical re-examination fundamentally obliterated the original coroner's findings, definitively concluding that Kathleen Savio did not die from a clumsy slip, but was the victim of a brutal, fiercely contested homicide characterized by a violent physical struggle. Baden's testimony painstakingly detailed a horrific constellation of injuries, completely inconsistent with a simple fall, highlighting severe, deep tissue bruising on her anterior torso, multiple defensive lacerations on her hands, and a catastrophic head wound that resulted from a massive application of blunt force trauma. The forensic analysis proved beyond any shadow of a doubt that Kathleen had fought desperately for her life against a powerful assailant, who violently subdued her, fractured her skull, and subsequently drowned her in the tub before completely draining the water to simulate an accident. This irrefutable scientific evidence paved the way for Peterson's arrest and initiated one of the most highly publicized, legally complex murder trials in modern American history, heavily reliant on a groundbreaking piece of legislation famously dubbed Drew's Law. This unprecedented legal statute allowed prosecutors to introduce crucial hearsay evidence, specifically enabling the jury to hear the terrified, prophetic statements made by both Kathleen and the missing Stacy to their friends and family, effectively allowing the silenced victims to testify against their killer from beyond the grave. The trial's climax centered on the brutal, psychological confrontation between Peterson's high-priced, incredibly aggressive defense team and the overwhelming, deeply emotional testimony of those who had witnessed his reign of domestic terror firsthand. The physical evidence of the dry tub and the extensive blunt force trauma, permanently bonded with Kathleen's own desperate, documented pleas for help, created an impenetrable web of guilt that completely neutralized Peterson's aura of law enforcement invincibility. The jury was faced with the undeniable, horrifying reality of a seasoned predator who utilized his badge, his physical dominance, and his intimate knowledge of crime scene processing to execute a near-perfect murder, only to be undone by the undeniable, immovable facts etched into the bones of his victim. Following weeks of exhausting, highly charged testimony and the meticulous presentation of the revised forensic timeline, the jury delivered a resounding, historically significant verdict of guilty, definitively concluding that former Police Sergeant Drew Peterson had murdered Kathleen Savio. He was ultimately sentenced to 38 years in a maximum security state penitentiary, a judicial mandate that effectively ensured the arrogant, deeply manipulative predator would spend the remainder of his natural life stripped of his freedom, his badge, and his unearned authority. While the conviction provided a profound, deeply necessary measure of justice for Kathleen's long-suffering family, the tragic saga remains frustratingly incomplete, as the body of his fourth wife, Stacy Peterson, has never been recovered, leaving her loved ones trapped in an agonizing, perpetual state of unresolved grief. The case stands as a monumental, deeply disturbing indictment of systemic police corruption and the catastrophic consequences of institutional bias, fundamentally altering how domestic violence allegations against active duty law enforcement officers are investigated across the nation. The successful prosecution of Drew Peterson demonstrated that even the most heavily fortified, expertly staged crime scenes cannot completely withstand the rigorous, relentless application of modern forensic pathology and the sheer, unyielding dedication of independent investigators. As we depart the claustrophobic, deeply corrupted suburban confines of Bolingbrook, Illinois, where a dry bathtub was weaponized to simulate a domestic accident, we must significantly expand our focus to a tragedy that occurred far beyond the reach of local jurisdictions. Leaving the firm ground of the American Midwest entirely, we plunge into the unpredictable, crushing depths of the vast ocean, investigating another husband who desperately claimed that the fatal circumstances surrounding his wife's demise were nothing more than an uncontrollable, tragic aquatic mishap. The transition from a staged drowning in a sterile bathroom to a supposed scuba diving accident on the ocean floor reveals the terrifying consistency of perpetrators who attempt to harness the lethal power of water to execute and conceal their darkest intentions. The highly anticipated, meticulously planned honeymoon of Gabe and Tina Watson was supposed to be the ultimate celebration of their newly forged union, an exotic escape from their familiar lives in Alabama to the breathtaking, vibrant expanses of the Great Barrier Reef in Queensland, Australia. Tina, a 26-year-old department store manager, was a deeply cautious, relatively inexperienced diver who had only recently completed her basic scuba certification, driven primarily by an intense desire to share in her new husband's absolute passion for the deep ocean. Gabe, in stark contrast, was a highly confident, physically imposing man who boasted advanced certifications as a trained rescue diver, presenting himself to both his bride and her anxious family as a thoroughly capable protector who could effortlessly manage any potential underwater hazards. The couple had officially married on October 11, 2003, and almost immediately embarked on an extensive journey across the globe, eventually boarding the Spoolsport, a renowned live-aboard dive vessel, for a week-long excursion navigating the complex, unpredictable currents of the Coral Sea. The specific site chosen for their fateful dive on the morning of October 22 was the historic, incredibly challenging wreckage of the SS Yongala, a sunken passenger ship resting 90 feet below the surface, widely notorious among maritime professionals for its sudden, powerful downdrafts and visually disorienting conditions. Despite her foundational training, Tina harbored deep-seated, documented anxieties regarding open water diving, expressing severe trepidation about the depth and the current to her fellow passengers in the days leading up to the excursion. Yet she ultimately yielded to Gabe's insistent reassurances. Her willingness to plunge into a hostile, unforgiving environment was rooted entirely in her profound trust in the man she had just married, fundamentally believing that his advanced rescue training essentially guaranteed her absolute physical safety against the formidable forces of the Pacific Ocean. The stark, undeniable disparity in their aquatic abilities is the foundational element of this tragedy, establishing a dynamic where one partner was entirely physically dependent on the other for survival in a setting where human life is inherently fragile and entirely reliant on life support equipment. Beneath the glittering, sunlit surface of the Australian waters, the majestic coral structures and teeming marine life masked a silent, deadly reality where a single mistake, a momentary panic, or a calculated act of malice could result in an instant, untraceable catastrophe. The stage was perfectly, tragically set for an excursion that would seamlessly transition from a picturesque honeymoon adventure into an international nautical nightmare, forever linking the pristine beauty of the Great Barrier Reef with a devastating loss of human life. The devastating rupture of their honeymoon illusion occurred mere minutes after the couple descended beneath the turbulent surface of the water, initiating a chaotic, deadly sequence of events that would leave Tina lifeless on the ocean floor and her husband frantically spinning a narrative of unavoidable tragedy. According to Gabe's initial, breathless accounts delivered to the bewildered crew upon his solitary return to the dive boat, the couple had encountered an unexpectedly strong, sweeping current shortly after beginning their descent, which allegedly triggered a sudden, severe panic attack in his novice wife. He passionately claimed that Tina began to thrash violently in the water, wildly grabbing at his equipment, inadvertently knocking his breathing regulator from his mouth and violently dislodging his diving mask, temporarily blinding and disorienting him in the critical moments of her distress. Gabe insisted to the authorities that after clearing his mask and regaining his own air supply, he made a desperate, physical attempt to grasp Tina's buoyancy compensator vest and pull her back toward the safety of the surface. But her flailing body was simply too heavy, and she began to rapidly sink away from him into the dark abyss. Instead of deploying his advanced rescue training, inflating her vest, or following her down to physically force the regulator into her mouth, Gabe made the highly controversial, fatal decision to abandon his drowning wife, rapidly ascending to the surface alone to desperately signal for help. By the time an independent dive master and a vacationing doctor recognized the unfolding catastrophe, mobilized a response, and plunged into the depths to retrieve her, Tina had already plummeted to the sea, resting completely unresponsive on her back near the rusted hull of the sunken ship. The frantic, physically exhausting efforts to haul her limp body back up to the deck of the Spolsport and administer aggressive, continuous cardiopulmonary resuscitation proved utterly futile, as the prolonged deprivation of oxygen had already caused irreversible, catastrophic brain death. She was officially pronounced dead amidst the chaotic, terrified atmosphere of the dive boat, instantly transforming the vessel from a luxurious vacation cruiser into a floating, deeply compromised crime scene isolated miles from the nearest coastline or immediate law enforcement intervention. The inciting incident was thus firmly established not merely by the tragic biological reality of a drowning, but by the profoundly disturbing, fundamentally unnatural sight of a certified rescue diver abandoning his frantic bride to the crushing depths while he actively sought his own absolute safety. The objective, physical fact that Gabe surfaced without her, completely unharmed and possessing all his functioning equipment, immediately ignited a firestorm of suspicion among the highly experienced dive community on board, laying the immediate groundwork for an unprecedented, global homicide investigation. This initial, terrifying event fundamentally shattered the boundary between an unpredictable natural disaster and a deeply suspicious human failure, forcing investigators to relentlessly question how a trained protector could allow the person he was sworn to cherish to silently suffocate in the open sea. As the shock of the incident subsided and the formal investigation by the Queensland Police Service commenced, Gabe Watson's carefully constructed narrative of an uncontrollable aquatic accident rapidly began to disintegrate under the immense, crushing weight of his own profound inconsistencies and undeniable, hard physical evidence. Detectives painstakingly documented that Gabe provided wildly varying, contradictory accounts of the tragic dive to nearly 24 different individuals, drastically changing critical details regarding the distance between them, the specific mechanics of their supposed physical struggle, and his exact sequence of actions when she began to sink. The investigation took a highly chilling, technologically indisputable turn when authorities seized and meticulously analyzed the digital data logs extracted directly from the couple's dive computers, which completely contradicted Gabe's frantic tale of a chaotic, prolonged struggle against an overpowering ocean current. The forensic data unequivocally demonstrated that, while Tina experienced a rapid, uninterrupted freefall to the ocean floor, Gabe's computer recorded a normal, highly controlled, and completely methodical ascent to the surface, indicating a calm, calculated retreat rather than the desperate, panicked escape he described. Furthermore, investigators made a completely accidental, deeply horrifying discovery when reviewing the underwater photographs taken by another unsuspecting tourist diving nearby, which inadvertently captured the exact, fatal moment unfolding in the murky background of a wide-angle scenic shot. The haunting photograph definitively showed Tina's lifeless, discarded body resting motionless on the ocean floor, while Gabe could be clearly seen in the upper frame, calmly swimming away toward the surface, completely unbothered by the fatal plight of his wife. As Australian authorities coordinated with law enforcement officials back in the United States, a massive, highly sinister financial motive was suddenly unearthed, revealing that Gabe had aggressively pressured Tina to vastly increase her life insurance policies and designate him as the absolute sole beneficiary just days before their wedding. Detectives in Alabama discovered that Gabe had specifically requested his employer to maximize his spousal life insurance coverage, creating a massive, multi-million-dollar financial incentive that perfectly aligned with the catastrophic failure of his duties as a rescue diver in a remote, foreign jurisdiction. The rising action was thus defined by this methodical, international dismantling of the grieving widower persona, systematically exposing a cold, calculating predator who allegedly utilized the inherently lethal, visually disorienting environment of an advanced shipwreck dive to execute a heavily premeditated, completely untraceable murder for immense financial gain. The sheer volume of circumstantial, digital, and photographic evidence heavily suggested that Gabe did not merely fail to rescue Tina, but actively facilitated her death, potentially by covertly turning off her air supplies, holding her underwater until she lost consciousness, and then simply abandoning her to the depths to guarantee her demise. The absolute peak of tension and the most complex, frustrating legal battles in the history of international jurisprudence materialized through a prolonged, bitter struggle spanning 2 continents, fundamentally testing the limits of how circumstantial maritime deaths can be prosecuted. The climax initially unfolded in an Australian courtroom, where a highly critical coroner's inquest definitively ruled that Gabe's actions and his calculated inactions directly caused Tina's death, prompting Gabe to legally maneuver and plead guilty to a lesser charge of manslaughter in Queensland to strategically avoid a life sentence for murder. This controversial plea deal, which resulted in a shockingly brief 18-month prison sentence in a foreign facility, ignited massive, visceral outrage across the United States, driving the Alabama Attorney General to take the entirely unprecedented step of indicting Gabe for capital murder upon his deportation back to American soil. The subsequent 2012 trial in Birmingham, Alabama became an intense, highly scrutinized spectacle, where prosecutors aggressively argued that Gabe had maliciously planned the murder within state lines, allowing them to legally bypass the severe double jeopardy restrictions that typically prevent dual prosecutions for the same crime. The prosecution presented a terrifying biomechanical theory of the murder, bringing in world-renowned diving experts who testified that Gabe likely used his superior physical strength to aggressively pin Tina underwater, intentionally switching off her primary air valve to induce rapid asphyxiation, before turning it back on to mask the evidence of his tampering. The defense fiercely countered this narrative by highlighting the absolute lack of direct, eyewitness testimony to the alleged physical assault, painting Gabe not as a calculating murderer, but as a deeply flawed, terrified Cord who tragically froze in a moment of extreme, unprecedented crisis, completely failing his moral obligations, but not legally committing an intentional homicide. The courtroom tension reached an agonizing zenith as the judge heavily scrutinized the prosecution's circumstantial evidence, rigorously questioning whether the complex data from the dive computers and the haunting background photograph truly met the incredibly high, absolute burden of proof required to secure a capital murder conviction in an American court. The entire legal strategy hinged precariously on proving the exact, invisible machinations of intent in an environment where the crucial forensic evidence had been perpetually washed away by the ocean currents, leaving the jury to grapple with the terrifying ambiguity of an unwitnessed death in the abyss. This climax represented a grueling high-stakes collision between the rigid, unyielding requirements of the legal system and the powerful, deeply emotional reality that a healthy, vibrant young woman had been entirely abandoned to die by the one person uniquely trained and morally obligated to save her. The sheer audacity of the alleged crime, weaponizing the ocean itself as an accomplice, forced the judicial system to confront the horrifying reality that some acts of intimate betrayal are engineered so perfectly within the chaos of nature that they become nearly impossible to definitively prosecute. The deeply polarizing and profoundly frustrating resolution to this international legal saga arrived abruptly when the presiding Alabama judge issued a highly controversial directed verdict of acquittal, fundamentally declaring that the prosecution had failed to present sufficient, undeniable evidence to prove that a deliberate murder had occurred. The judge legally dismissed the capital murder charges before the case could even be deliberated by the jury, effectively ending the grueling, multi-year ordeal and officially allowing Gabe Watson to walk out of the courthouse as a permanently free man, entirely cleared of all charges in his home country. This abrupt, fiercely debated judicial decision left Tina's devastated family absolutely shattered, completely depriving them of the closure they had desperately sought and condemning them to an agonizing, perpetual state of unresolved grief over the loss of their daughter. While Gabe successfully evaded a murder conviction, the dark, irrefutable shadow of his profound cowardice and the deeply suspicious circumstances surrounding the fatal dive remain permanently attached to his public legacy, serving as a chilling, heavily debated case study within both legal and professional diving communities worldwide. The actual truth of what transpired in those final, terrifying moments near the hull of the Yongala remains securely locked within the silent, crushing depths of the Coral Sea, an eternal secret swallowed by the vast, unforgiving expanse of the Pacific Ocean. The conclusion of this deeply unsettling maritime tragedy reinforces the terrifying reality that the natural world, with its inherent isolation and unpredictable forces, can provide the ultimate, impenetrable cover for those who harbor the darkest, most lethal intentions toward their partners. As we depart the silent, suffocating depths of the South Pacific and leave behind the profound ambiguities of this aquatic nightmare, we must transition back to solid, albeit equally treacherous, ground. We now shift our focus from the vast expanse of the open ocean to a dark, desolate stretch of a Florida coastline, where the rhythmic crashing of the waves provided the auditory backdrop for another husband who violently claimed that a sudden, terrifying tragedy struck his wife during a supposedly romantic evening stroll. From a stage drowning in the abyss, we arrive at a secluded beach where a meticulously planned execution was heavily disguised as a random, chaotic robbery gone devastatingly wrong. Justin and April Barber resided in the affluent coastal regions of Florida, projecting an outward image of a thriving, upwardly mobile young couple navigating the early years of a seemingly successful marriage. April, a deeply loved 27-year-old with a bright professional future, was widely known for her unwavering dedication and vibrant personality, remaining entirely unaware of the dark, financial rot actively consuming her husband's secret life. Justin, heavily burdened by mounting, entirely hidden debts and engaging in numerous covert extramarital affairs, maintained a charming, highly deceptive exterior that successfully masked his profound sociopathic detachment from his vows. To celebrate their third wedding anniversary in August of 2002, Justin meticulously orchestrated what appeared to be a deeply romantic, spontaneous evening, concluding with a late-night stroll along the shores of Guana River State Park. This specific stretch of the Florida coastline, while undeniably stunning during the daylight hours, systematically transforms into a remarkably desolate, pitch-black, and highly isolated environment immediately after sunset. The location is completely devoid of artificial lighting, active security cameras, or casual pedestrian traffic, rendering it an absolute blind spot for local law enforcement patrols or potential civilian witnesses. The sheer, oppressive darkness of the Atlantic beach provided an impenetrable, silent backdrop for a supposedly intimate milestone, effectively separating the couple from the safety of the populated suburbs. By placing them in this highly vulnerable, secluded vacuum, Justin intentionally engineered a geographical advantage where any sudden cries for help would be swallowed entirely by the rhythmic, deafening crash of the ocean waves. Understanding the deliberate, calculated selection of this incredibly remote environment is absolutely essential, as it heavily implies a premeditated isolation rather than a mere romantic preference for an evening walk. The chilling, undeniable reality of this exposition is that April Barber walked hand in hand onto that desolate sand, genuinely believing she was celebrating a milestone of eternal love, completely oblivious to the horrifying fact that she was being systematically guided into a carefully pre-selected execution zone. The terrifying, violent rupture of this supposed anniversary celebration occurred when a heavily bleeding, frantic Justin Barber suddenly emerged from the darkness of the coastal highway. He desperately flagged down a passing, terrified motorist in the middle of the night to aggressively plead for immediate emergency medical assistance. He was actively suffering from 4 distinct gunshot wounds to his upper body and hands, presenting a chaotic, adrenaline-fueled narrative of a sudden, brutal ambush by an unknown assailant. According to Justin's breathless, agonizing account delivered to the stunned Good Samaritan and subsequently to local law enforcement, a lone, unidentified mugger had emerged from the dunes and demanded their valuables at gunpoint. This supposed confrontation triggered a desperate, violent physical struggle on the sand that rapidly culminated in a chaotic, fatal exchange of gunfire in the pitch black. He passionately claimed that during this frantic fight for survival, the phantom assailant shot him multiple times before turning the weapon directly on April, fatally striking her in the face. The attacker then allegedly vanished without a single trace back into the impenetrable darkness of the Florida coastline, leaving Justin to manage a catastrophic medical emergency completely alone. Justin insisted that despite his severe, bleeding injuries, he heroically managed to drag April's heavy, unresponsive body all the way back to their SUV, frantically driving miles down the highway. First responders and medical personnel were confronted with a horrific, blood-soaked scene within the vehicle, officially pronouncing April dead from a catastrophic, close-range gunshot wound upon their arrival. This chaotic, bloody emergence onto the highway served as the definitive inciting incident, instantly launching a massive, high-stakes manhunt for a phantom killer, even as seasoned homicide detectives immediately noted subtle, jarring inconsistencies in the surviving husband's frantic performance. As the intensive police investigation rapidly transitioned from a frantic, widespread search for a random mugger to a methodical, forensic examination of the surviving husband, Justin's carefully rehearsed narrative began to completely disintegrate under the harsh, uncompromising light of objective crime scene analysis. The physical evidence recovered from the desolate beach entirely contradicted the dramatic story of a chaotic, sandy struggle, leaving seasoned investigators deeply suspicious of the entire event. Crime scene technicians found absolutely no secondary set of footprints leading away from the site, no signs of a desperate physical scuffle in the dunes, and no scattered valuables to suggest a robbery had ever genuinely taken place. The most devastating, physically undeniable blow to Justin's fabricated alibi came from a highly specialized, rigorous blood spatter analysis conducted on the clothing he wore that fateful night, which completely defied the fundamental physics of his described sequence of events. Forensic experts painstakingly demonstrated that the microscopic, high-velocity mist of April's blood permanently embedded deep within the fabric of Justin's shirt could only have been deposited if he was the one actively holding and firing the weapon at exceptionally close range. This irrefutable scientific evidence utterly destroyed his desperate claim that he was merely an innocent bystander, desperately trying to protect his wife during her brutal execution. This damning, heavily documented forensic reality prompted detectives to aggressively dig into the hidden, highly guarded facets of Justin's personal life, stripping away his polished exterior to reveal a man in deep crisis. Financial investigators rapidly unearthed a staggering, multi-million-dollar motive that provided a chilling, highly logical context for the cold-blooded assassination on the sand, discovering that Justin was drowning in severe, unmanageable debt, desperately seeking to fund his secret, lavish lifestyle characterized by chronic infidelity. He had recently, aggressively pushed to secure a massive $2 million life insurance policy on his young, completely unsuspecting wife. The investigation definitively revealed a cold, highly sociopathic predator who recognized that surviving the attack with superficial, self-inflicted gunshot wounds was an absolutely necessary, strategic component to perfectly sell the illusion of a random, devastating tragedy to the local authorities and his grieving in-laws. The absolute, undeniable peak of tension and the final, catastrophic destruction of Justin Barber's completely fabricated reality did not occur on a sandy beach, but within the sterile, highly technical confines of a modern digital forensics laboratory. Investigators executing a comprehensive search warrant on Justin's personal computers successfully bypassed his rudimentary, deeply amateurish deletion attempts, gaining full access to his hidden hard drive. The cyber forensic team recovered a deeply chilling, meticulously documented trail of highly specific internet searches that served as a terrifying, step-by-step digital blueprint for premeditated murder. The recovered digital footprint unequivocally revealed that in the weeks immediately leading up to the fatal anniversary walk, Justin had extensively researched the specific physiological effects of non-lethal gunshot wounds. He heavily queried complex medical terms, specifically related to surviving severe trauma to the right chest, precisely mirroring the exact, carefully placed injuries he eventually inflicted upon his own body. Furthermore, the analysts unearthed highly incriminating, highly targeted searches regarding the specific mechanics of Florida firearms laws, alongside incredibly specific queries on how to successfully fake a violent robbery to intentionally mislead seasoned homicide detectives. Perhaps the most deeply disturbing, sociopathic artifact recovered from his digital history was the intentional download of the Guns N' Roses song, Used to Love Her, featuring lyrics explicitly detailing the murder and burial of a complaining partner. When confronted with this impenetrable, overwhelming mountain of digital and physical forensic evidence, during the highly anticipated murder trial, Justin's high-priced defense team fundamentally collapsed. They were entirely unable to rationally explain away the high-velocity blood spatter on his shirt or the terrifying, premeditated roadmap permanently etched into his recovered internet browser history. This climax represented a monumental, historical triumph for digital forensic science, proving to the jury beyond any reasonable doubt that Justin had not only coldly executed his wife, but had actively researched exactly how much pain he needed to inflict upon himself to successfully cash a $2 million check. Faced with the overwhelming, inescapable combination of objective blood spatter physics, an undeniably massive financial motive, and a deeply chilling digital confession, the Florida jury swiftly and decisively convicted Justin Barber of first-degree, highly premeditated murder. The presiding judge, fiercely condemning the sheer, calculated brutality and the profound sociopathic greed that exclusively drove the assassination, completely stripped him of his remaining freedom. He was immediately sentenced to serve life in a maximum security state penitentiary, without the absolute possibility of parole, permanently neutralizing his lethal threat to society and ending his elaborate charade. April Barber's tragic, entirely preventable death remains a profound, heartbreaking testament within the judicial system to the extreme, terrifying lengths an individual will go to orchestrate a massive financial windfall. This specific case is frequently utilized in modern investigative training to definitively prove that even the most seemingly random, chaotic acts of nighttime violence are often meticulously designed, deeply personal illusions. The unyielding permanence of digital footprints and the uncompromising laws of fluid dynamics ultimately ensured that the desolate darkness of the Florida beach could not permanently conceal the brutal reality of his actions. As we leave the dark, isolated shores of the Atlantic coastline, moving far away from a calculated murder heavily disguised as a random, violent mugging, we must dramatically expand the scope of our true crime investigation. The focus now shifts from a highly secluded, deeply intimate execution to a tragedy characterized by a sheer, unimaginable scale of devastating collateral damage. Transitioning rapidly from an empty oceanic crime scene to a highly crowded, deeply chaotic household in the heart of England, we will now analyze a heavily publicized, deeply infuriating incident of domestic deception. We will examine the horrifying reality of a narcissistic patriarch who desperately attempted to frame an innocent party to win a custody battle, resulting in a fiery catastrophe that claimed the lives of those he was supposed to protect. Mick Philpott was a highly controversial, intensely narcissistic figure in Derby, England, whose deeply chaotic domestic life had already attracted significant, entirely negative media attention long before the devastating tragedy that would ultimately define his legacy. Operating essentially as the tyrannical patriarch of a heavily crowded, deeply dysfunctional household entirely subsidized by the British welfare system, Philpott resided in a cramped council house with both his legally wedded wife Mairead and his long-term live-in mistress, Lisa Willis. For years, this highly unstable, deeply toxic triad functioned under Philpott's absolute, coercive control, creating an environment where extreme emotional manipulation, financial exploitation, and chronic domestic hostility were normalized as standard daily routines. He fathered a staggering total of 17 children across multiple relationships, treating his massive, highly publicized brood less as a beloved family and significantly more as a highly lucrative, state-funded financial enterprise that allowed him to completely avoid legitimate employment. The fragile, deeply unbalanced ecosystem of the Victory Road residence fundamentally collapsed when Lisa Willis, finally exhausted by years of his suffocating, deeply abusive behavior, abruptly packed her belongings and fled the property, taking her 5 children with her. This sudden, absolute defiance completely shattered Philpott's deeply ingrained, sociopathic need for absolute dominance, instantly transforming his previous domestic complacency into a dangerous, highly volatile obsession driven by a terrifying desire for vindictive retaliation. He aggressively launched a bitter, highly contested custody battle, utilizing every manipulative tactic at his disposal to torment Lisa and force her return, completely unable to accept the public humiliation of a woman successfully escaping his controlling grip. Behind the closed doors of his remaining household, Philpott began to meticulously formulate a deeply sinister, completely reckless plan specifically designed to frame his former mistress for a severe, violent crime, genuinely believing he could manipulate the local authorities into permanently neutralizing his newly formed adversary. Understanding the sheer, boundless depths of his narcissism and his absolute disregard for the safety of his dependents is fundamentally critical, as it perfectly sets the stage for a calculated, highly theatrical stunt that was violently, catastrophically derailed by the unpredictable physics of combustion. The deeply toxic atmosphere of the Derby household was an active, highly pressurized powder keg, merely waiting for Philpott to strike the match that would permanently destroy the lives of the innocent children he was morally obligated to protect. The horrifying, catastrophic culmination of Philpott's vindictive obsession erupted in the agonizingly early pitch black hours of May 11, 2012, when a massive, ferociously hot blaze suddenly engulfed the front hallway of the Victory Road residence, instantly trapping the sleeping family on the upper floor. Emergency services received a frantic, deeply chaotic emergency call from Philpott, who breathlessly reported that his home was completely consumed by fire and that his beloved children were hopelessly trapped in their upstairs bedrooms. When the first wave of highly trained firefighters and local police officers frantically breached the perimeter of the blazing structure, they were immediately met with a deeply horrific, completely unsurvivable inferno that had rapidly escalated far beyond a standard, accidental house fire. Despite the desperate, incredibly courageous efforts of the emergency responders who aggressively battled the intense, suffocating smoke and roaring flames to reach the upper level, the sheer speed and ferocity of the blaze ultimately claimed the lives of 6 incredibly young, entirely innocent Philpott children. In the immediate, highly chaotic aftermath of the devastating inferno, Philpott rapidly positioned himself precisely in the center of the intense national media spotlight, presenting a deeply dramatic, highly theatrical performance of a broken, grieving father who had valiantly, yet unsuccessfully, attempted to rescue his trapped offspring. He aggressively utilized multiple, highly publicized press conferences to tearfully recount his supposed heroic actions, desperately sobbing for the television cameras, while simultaneously, deliberately planting the deeply sinister suggestion that the fire was a targeted, malicious arson attack orchestrated by his estranged mistress or her family. This profoundly disturbing, highly public display of manufactured grief served as the definitive inciting incident for the criminal investigation, instantly transforming a catastrophic residential structure fire into a massive, heavily scrutinized homicide inquiry closely watched by the entire British public. Seasoned fire investigators and local detectives, intimately familiar with the distinct, undeniable psychological patterns of genuine trauma, immediately noted glaring, deeply troubling inconsistencies in Philpott's highly performative emotional displays and the timeline of his supposed rescue attempts. The inciting incident was not merely the tragic, devastating loss of 6 young lives, but the immediate, highly calculated deployment of Philpott's fabricated narrative, a terrifying illusion specifically designed to weaponize a deadly tragedy to secure total victory in his bitter, ongoing custody dispute. This fundamental, deeply disturbing disconnect between the horrific, silent reality of the charred children's bedrooms and the loud, aggressively theatrical weeping of their father immediately laid the groundwork for an investigation that would uncover a deeply sociopathic conspiracy. As the initial, profound shock of the tragedy slowly subsided and the meticulous, highly technical forensic analysis of the burned out structure commenced, Philpott's carefully constructed narrative of a cowardly, external arson attack rapidly began to completely unravel under the intense scrutiny of modern scientific investigation. Specialist fire investigators meticulously sifting through the charred, completely destroyed remnants of the front hallway discovered definitive, highly damning traces of a specific liquid chemical accelerant, unequivocally proving that the fire was deliberately, intentionally ignited from the inside of the letterbox rather than accidentally sparked or thrown from the street. This crucial, undeniable physical evidence directly contradicted Philpott's frantic assertions, prompting the police to completely shift their focus from the targeted mistress to the highly suspicious, intensely theatrical father and his deeply compliant wife, Merritt, alongside their close family friend, Paul Mosley. Recognizing the intense, deeply ingrained deception operating within the surviving household, investigators implemented a highly aggressive, deeply covert surveillance strategy, strategically placing the supposedly grieving parents in a heavily bugged, tightly monitored hotel room under the guise of providing them with protective, state-funded emergency accommodation. For weeks, highly trained police technicians meticulously monitored the secret audio feeds, capturing hundreds of hours of heavily whispered, deeply incriminating conversations where Mick and Merritt actively, methodically discussed their fabricated alibis, repeatedly reassuring each other to strictly maintain the lies they had fed to the press and the detective. The covert recordings captured a deeply chilling, profoundly sociopathic dynamic where Philpott constantly, aggressively directed his wife's testimony, violently demanding absolute loyalty and completely exposing the terrifying reality that the devastating fire was actually a heavily botched, deeply reckless publicity stunt explicitly designed to frame Lisa Willis. The rising action was characterized by this methodical, deeply disturbing extraction of the hidden truth, revealing that Philpott had intentionally poured the petrol and lit the match with the specific, delusional intention of staging a heroic, completely safe rescue of his children, only to be entirely thwarted when the intense fire spread with unimaginable, uncontrollable speed. Furthermore, the investigation revealed that Philpott's supposed heroic rescue attempts were entirely fabricated. He had specifically chosen not to smash the upstairs windows to pull the children out, effectively abandoning them to the suffocating smoke the absolute second his deeply reckless, intensely narcissistic stunt devolved into a genuine, highly lethal emergency. The gradual, systematic accumulation of the forensic fire analysis, combined with the completely unassailable, deeply terrifying reality of the covered hotel recordings, entirely dismantled the illusion of the tragic patriarch, exposing a man who literally gambled the lives of his own children in a twisted, fundamentally sociopathic attempt to maintain absolute domestic control. The absolute peak of tension and the final, deeply satisfying destruction of Mick Philpott's entirely fabricated, intensely narcissistic reality materialized during the incredibly high-profile, deeply emotional criminal trial held at the Nottingham Crown Court, an event that completely captivated and horrified the entire British nation. The climax of the judicial proceedings centered precisely on the devastating, entirely irrefutable presentation of the covert police surveillance tapes, forcing the jury to sit in absolute, chilling silence as they listened directly to the whispered, highly calculated confessions of the individuals responsible for the deaths of 6 innocent children. The prosecution meticulously, aggressively deconstructed the sheer, unimaginable recklessness of the staged rescue plot, expertly utilizing fire dynamics specialists to unequivocally prove how the specific volume of petrol used, combined with the structural layout of the hallway, created a completely unsurvivable, highly toxic inferno within mere seconds of ignition. When Philpott finally, aggressively took the witness stand in a desperate, heavily delusional attempt to save himself, his deeply ingrained, violently arrogant nature completely consumed his performance, resulting in a highly combative, deeply disastrous cross-examination where he frequently lashed out at the prosecutors and blatantly contradicted his own meticulously recorded statements. The courtroom tension reached an absolute, agonizing zenith when the prosecution expertly cornered him with the physical impossibility of his timeline, definitively proving that his supposed desperate attempts to save the children were nothing more than a shallow, highly performative pantomime executed for the benefit of the surrounding neighbors and the arriving emergency crews. The defense fundamentally, completely collapsed under the overwhelming, entirely crushing weight of the objective fire science, the undeniable audio confessions, and the deeply horrifying reality that a father could be so consumed by vindictive malice that he would deliberately set his own heavily populated home ablaze. The jury was confronted with the ultimate, entirely terrifying embodiment of extreme, highly lethal narcissism, recognizing that Philpott did not necessarily intend to execute his children, but viewed them as entirely expendable props in a deeply deranged, highly calculated theatrical production meant to secure an ultimate victory in family court. This climax represented the total, irreversible exposure of a deeply parasitic, highly dangerous predator, permanently stripping away the carefully manufactured mask of the tearful, devastated victim to reveal a cold, highly calculating manipulator whose absolute obsession with control had ultimately resulted in an unimaginable, highly preventable massacre. Faced with the entirely overwhelming, completely cohesive mountain of forensic evidence and the deeply chilling reality of the covered audio recordings, the jury swiftly and decisively delivered unanimous, highly anticipated verdicts of guilty, officially convicting Mick Philpott, Merritt Philpott, and Paul Mosley of 6 counts of manslaughter, The presiding judge, fiercely and publicly condemning the sheer, highly calculated brutality, the extreme sociopathic narcissism, and the profoundly disturbing lack of genuine remorse displayed throughout the trial, handed Mick Philpott an incredibly severe, truly exceptional sentence of life in prison, permanently neutralizing his ability to manipulate or harm another vulnerable individual. The devastating, deeply entirely preventable deaths of the 6 children sent a massive, highly visceral shockwave of outrage and deep mourning across the entire United Kingdom, prompting intense, widespread national debates regarding the absolute necessity of stricter interventions in deeply toxic, heavily documented abusive domestic environments before they inevitably escalate to lethal violence. The burned-out shell of the Derby Council House was eventually completely demolished by local authorities, removing the dark, physical monument of the tragedy from the community. But the deeply horrifying legacy of the staged, absolutely catastrophic rescue stunt remains permanently etched into the annals of modern British criminal history. The successful, highly aggressive prosecution effectively demonstrated that even the most elaborate, highly publicized theatrical displays of manufactured grief cannot permanently obscure the objective, immovable realities of combustion science and the silent, undeniable testimony of the deceased victims. As we decisively leave the charred, deeply tragic ruins of the English council estate, completely moving away from a catastrophic staged rescue born of intense narcissistic rage, we must now heavily shift our focus to a tragedy deeply rooted in the desperate preservation of a completely fabricated, highly successful identity. Transitioning from a highly public, completely chaotic household engulfed in physical flames, we arrive at a seemingly perfect, incredibly quiet apartment in Utah, where an ambitious young husband was actively hiding a massive, life-altering secret that would ultimately result in a deeply violent, highly deceptive disappearance. We will now meticulously analyze how the complete, sudden collapse of a meticulously constructed academic lie led a supposed future medical student to completely eradicate the only person who discovered his absolute, deeply pathetic truth. The sunlit, picturesque streets of Salt Lake City, Utah, provided the perfect, heavily sanitized backdrop for the seemingly flawless marriage of Mark and Lori Hacking, a young couple widely revered within their tight, knit religious community. Mark, outwardly presenting himself as a brilliant, highly driven academic prodigy, had meticulously constructed an elaborate, completely fabricated reality where he was an honors graduate from the University of Utah, on the precipice of attending medical school. Lori, a vibrant, deeply devoted 27-year-old financial analyst who was 5 weeks pregnant with their first child, worked tirelessly to financially support the household, entirely anchoring her future to her husband's supposed collegiate triumphs. However, beneath the polished, enviable facade of their suburban apartment, Mark's entire existence was fundamentally built upon a colossal, multi-year foundation of pathological deception that had successfully fooled his wife, his parents, and his closest friends. In absolute reality, Mark had discreetly dropped out of his undergraduate programs years prior, spending his days secretly wandering campus grounds, playing video games, and painstakingly forging elaborate university transcripts to maintain his devastating illusion. He had gone to the extreme lengths of faking an exhaustive application process, ultimately presenting Lori with completely fraudulent acceptance letters to the prestigious medical program at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. As the inescapable deadline for their heavily planned cross-country move to North Carolina rapidly approached, the sheer, crushing weight of his compounding lies created an intensely volatile, highly pressurized psychological environment within his own mind. The impending collision between his carefully curated, fictional universe and the absolute, objective reality of their future represented a catastrophic threat to his ego, transforming him into a deeply desperate, highly cornered predator. Understanding the sheer magnitude and duration of this psychological fraud is absolutely vital, as it frames the subsequent violence not as a sudden, unpredictable domestic dispute, but as the calculated, cowardly eradication of the only person capable of exposing his profound inadequacies. orderly apartment was merely a staging ground for a man who ultimately decided that executing his pregnant wife was a more acceptable outcome than facing the profound public humiliation of his own spectacular failures. The horrifying rupture of this meticulously maintained facade occurred on the morning of July 19, 2004, when Mark Hacking initiated a frantic, deeply orchestrated emergency call to local authorities, breathlessly reporting his wife as a missing person. He passionately claimed to the dispatchers and subsequently to the rapidly arriving local media that Lori had vanished without a single trace after leaving their apartment at dawn for her routine morning jog in the heavily wooded Memory Grove Park. This highly public declaration instantly mobilized a massive, highly coordinated search effort, drawing hundreds of desperate community volunteers, trained search dogs, and seasoned police officers to the winding trails and dense brush of the popular recreational area. The discovery of Lori's vehicle, found suspiciously parked near the entrance of the canyon, initially seemed to corroborate his terrifying narrative of a random, violent abduction, sending a profound shockwave of panic throughout the supposedly safe Utah capital. However, seasoned homicide detectives immediately noted highly subtle, deeply troubling inconsistencies in Mark's highly performative emotional displays, observing a man who appeared more focused on managing the logistical narrative of the search than experiencing genuine, paralyzing grief. The inciting incident was not merely the tragic disappearance of a beloved community member, but the immediate, highly calculated deployment of Mark's fabricated alibi, a desperate illusion specifically designed to weaponize the inherent dangers of an isolated park to mask a domestic execution. He aggressively utilized the local news cameras to plead for her safe return, shedding crocodile tears and begging phantom kidnappers for mercy, entirely confident that his lifelong ability to lie would successfully manipulate the seasoned investigators. This massive, public deception fundamentally shifted the entire trajectory of the morning, transforming a localized missing person case into an intense, heavily scrutinized psychological chess match between a pathological liar and an increasingly suspicious police force. The glaring disconnect between the sprawling, chaotic search grid in the canyon and the deeply sinister, completely silent reality of what truly occurred inside their apartment laid the immediate groundwork for an investigation that would soon expose his terrifying secrets. The frantic hunt for a phantom jogger served as the absolute catalyst for the unraveling of Mark's life, pulling the thread that would quickly dismantle his entire academic and professional fantasy. As the intense police investigation rapidly transitioned from a frantic, widespread search in the park to a methodical, forensic examination of the surviving husband, Mark's completely fabricated reality began to disintegrate under the harsh light of objective inquiry. Detectives conducting a standard background verification routinely contacted the University of North Carolina to confirm his impending enrollment, only to discover the shocking, undeniable truth that the medical school had absolutely no record of a Mark Hacking ever applying. This devastating revelation prompted a massive, deep dive investigation into his entire academic history, rapidly unearthing the fact that he had never graduated from the University of Utah and had been systematically lying to his entire family for nearly 5 years. Simultaneously, forensic technicians executing a comprehensive search warrant on the couple's supposedly pristine apartment discovered highly damning physical anomalies, including subtle, distinct traces of human blood on the headboard and a recently purchased, completely new mattress replacing their original bed. Investigators obtained highly crucial, deeply revealing telephone records that definitively proved Lori had called the North Carolina Medical School herself just days prior to her disappearance, officially discovering the absolute, horrifying truth regarding her husband's colossal deception. The sudden, overwhelming exposure of his secret life triggered a profound psychological collapse in Mark, leading to a bizarre, highly disturbing incident where he was found running completely naked outside a local motel, resulting in his immediate, involuntary psychiatric hospitalization. While he was safely secured within the sterile, heavily monitored confines of the psychiatric ward, police strategically focused their efforts on local waste management facilities, correctly deducing that the missing mattress and a potentially massive crime scene had been violently discarded. The rising action was characterized by this methodical, entirely unyielding extraction of the hidden truth, revealing a cold, calculating predator who systematically erased the physical evidence of his domestic life to protect a completely shattered ego. The gradual, systematic accumulation of the undeniable academic fraud, combined with the deeply suspicious forensic anomalies inside the bedroom, completely dismantled the illusion of the grieving husband, exposing a man who literally threw away his pregnant wife to sustain a lie. The entire Utah community watched in captivated horror as the impenetrable armor of a supposed golden boy was systematically stripped away by the unrelenting persistence of objective investigation, leaving behind nothing but a profoundly dangerous, deeply pathetic fraud. The absolute peak of tension and the final, catastrophic destruction of Mark Hacking's lifelong deception did not occur in a dramatic courtroom or an interrogation room, but within the quiet, highly restrictive confines of the psychiatric hospital. The climax materialized when Mark, unable to permanently sustain the crushing psychological weight of his own monstrous actions, requested a private meeting with his two older brothers, who had faithfully supported him throughout the agonizing public search. During this deeply chilling, profoundly heartbreaking confrontation, the carefully constructed facade completely collapsed, and Mark offered a full, horrifyingly detailed confession, unequivocally admitting that he had brutally murdered his wife in the middle of the night. He painstakingly detailed the timeline, explaining that after Lori had confronted him with the devastating truth of his academic lies, she retreated to their bedroom in a state of profound distress, choosing to sleep rather than continue the explosive argument. As she lay completely vulnerable and asleep in their shared bed, Mark retrieved a .22 caliber rifle, crept into the darkness of the room, and coldly executed his pregnant wife with a single, highly deliberate shot to the head. He then systematically described the gruesome, highly calculated aftermath, detailing how he tightly wrapped her lifeless body in garbage bags, disposed of her remains in a local commercial dumpster, and frantically worked to replace the blood-soaked mattress before the sun rose. The sheer horror of the psychiatric ward confrontation lay in the absolute, undeniable proof that Mark had stood over her, fully conscious and aware of his impending actions, prioritizing the preservation of his own pathetic pride over the lives of his wife and unborn child. Horrified and morally compelled by the sheer brutality of the revelation, his brothers immediately left the hospital facility and relayed the entirety of the gruesome confession directly to the homicide detectives, completely obliterating any remaining defensive strategies. This climax represented the ultimate, highly devastating triumph of the objective truth over a lifetime of deeply ingrained, narcissistic manipulation, permanently transforming a desperate search and rescue operation into a grim, highly complex recovery mission. The confession served as a chilling, heavily documented testament to the banality of evil, demonstrating exactly how a deeply insecure individual could weaponize a firearm to execute and dispose of their partner, rather than face the absolute reality of their own failures. Following the devastating confession, the criminal investigation pivoted entirely toward a massive, incredibly grueling, and highly hazardous physical search of the sprawling Salt Lake County landfill, an operation that demanded the relentless dedication of specialized recovery teams. After weeks of meticulously sifting through thousands of tons of compacted garbage under the blistering summer sun, investigators finally recovered Lori Hacking's remains, bringing a deeply grim, entirely undeniable sense of finality to the horrific ordeal. The recovery of the physical evidence, combined with the irrefutable testimony of his own brothers, forced Mark Hacking to entirely abandon any prospect of a trial, leading him to officially plead guilty to the first-degree murder of his wife, the presiding judge fiercely condemning the sheer, highly calculated brutality and the profound sociopathic narcissism that exclusively drove the cowardly execution, sentenced Mark to a minimum of 6 years to life in the Utah State Penitentiary. Lori's tragic, entirely preventable death remains a profound, heartbreaking testament within the judicial system to the extreme, terrifying lengths a pathological liar will go to protect a completely fabricated identity from the uncompromising light of truth. The case is frequently utilized in modern psychological and investigative training to definitively prove that severe, highly documented academic or financial fraud within a marriage is a massive red flag that can rapidly, violently escalate into domestic homicide. The unyielding permanence of the forensic reality and the absolute dedication of the recovery teams ultimately ensured that the crushing weight of the local landfill could not permanently conceal the brutal reality of his actions. As we decisively leave the sterile, deeply deceptive atmosphere of the Utah apartment, completely moving away from a calculated execution born of intense narcissistic shame, we must dramatically shift our focus to a tragedy characterized by a different brand of chaotic deceit. Transitioning from a highly premeditated, silent domestic assassination to a completely chaotic, highly violent confrontation on a remote dirt road, we arrive at a heavily publicized case involving a deeply manipulative young woman and a fatal love triangle. We will now meticulously analyze the deeply disturbing reality of a perpetrator who emerged from a secluded dairy farm covered in blood, desperately attempting to convince seasoned investigators that a brutal, sustained stabbing was nothing more than a tragic, accidental fall onto a knife during a frantic struggle for self-defense. In the relatively quiet, unassuming college town of Eau Claire, Wisconsin, Ezra McCandless navigated a highly complex, chaotic web of overlapping romantic entanglements that fundamentally relied upon her deeply ingrained capacity for pathological manipulation. Originally born Rosalind, Ezra had carefully cultivated a highly dramatic, attention-seeking persona that heavily dictated the volatile dynamics she established with the men who were unfortunate enough to be drawn into her orbit. At the center of this deeply unstable romantic matrix was her primary, long-term boyfriend Jason Mengel, a man who remained entirely oblivious to the profound depths of her ongoing, secret infidelities. Concurrently, Ezra was actively engaged in an intense, highly secretive affair with Alex Woodworth, a 24-year-old barista, aspiring philosopher, and substitute teacher who possessed a gentle demeanor that made him highly susceptible to her aggressive emotional machinations. The fragile, meticulously balanced illusion of her dual life began to violently fracture in early 2018 when Jason finally discovered the absolute truth regarding her extensive relationship with Alex, instantly triggering a massive, highly explosive confrontation that threatened to completely destroy Ezra's carefully curated social reality. Faced with the sudden, terrifying prospect of losing absolute control over both men, Ezra plunged into a state of profound psychological crisis, desperately attempting to manipulate the fallout through a series of erratic, highly theatrical displays of emotional distress. She recognized that her primary source of validation and control was rapidly evaporating, creating an incredibly pressurized, toxic psychological environment where she felt an absolute, deeply sociopathic need to permanently resolve the romantic conflict on her own violent terms. Understanding the sheer intensity of this manufactured emotional crisis is absolutely essential, as it heavily frames the subsequent fatal encounter, not as a random tragedy, but as the inevitable, explosive culmination of a narcissist rapidly losing her grip on her victims. The quiet streets of Eau Claire merely provided the staging ground for a deeply disturbed young woman who ultimately decided that executing her secret lover was the only viable method to permanently silence the source of her impending social humiliation. This deeply toxic, highly volatile atmosphere perfectly set the stage for a calculated, highly orchestrated ambush heavily disguised as a desperate act of self-defense. The horrifying, deeply violent rupture of this domestic tension occurred late in the afternoon of March 27, 2018, when a local dairy farmer operating in the highly secluded, rural expanses of Dunn County, Wisconsin, witnessed a deeply disturbing scene unfolding on his property. Ezra McCandless suddenly emerged from the thick brush surrounding a highly isolated, muddy dirt road, appearing highly frantic, completely covered in thick mud and drying blood, and inexplicably wearing nothing but a tattered shirt and her underwear. She desperately flagged down the bewildered farmer, initiating a highly performative, deeply theatrical display of sheer panic as she breathlessly informed him and the subsequently arriving emergency dispatchers that she had just barely survived a horrific, brutally violent sexual assault. According to the deeply chaotic, frantic narrative she immediately provided to the initial wave of first responders, she and Alex Woodworth had been driving along the remote trail when her vehicle suddenly became deeply entrenched and hopelessly stuck in the thick spring mud. She passionately claimed that the stressful situation inexplicably caused Alex to enter a state of violent, unpredictable mania, leading him to aggressively attack her within the confined space of the stranded vehicle. Ezra insisted that during this sudden, terrifying physical struggle for her own life, she managed to retrieve a knife from the cabin to defend herself against his supposed relentless assault. The absolute crux of her fabricated alibi relied entirely upon her frantic assertion that during the chaotic, violent scuffle in the mud, Alex had tragically, accidentally tripped and forcefully plunged his own body entirely onto the stationary blade she was holding. This dramatic, highly publicized emergence onto the dairy farm served as the definitive inciting incident, instantly launching a massive homicide investigation, while she aggressively attempted to frame a brutal execution as a chaotic, profoundly unfortunate accident born of legitimate self-defense. The glaring, immediate disconnect between her highly articulate, deeply rehearsed narrative of a clumsy fall and the sheer volume of blood soaking her skin instantly raised significant, highly troubling red flags for the seasoned detectives arriving at the remote perimeter. As the intense, highly coordinated police investigation rapidly transitioned from securing the survivor to meticulously processing the abandoned vehicle on the muddy trail, Ezra's carefully constructed narrative of an accidental fall rapidly began to completely disintegrate under the crushing weight of modern forensic science. Homicide detectives easily located the stranded car and discovered Alex Woodworth's severely mutilated, lifeless body partially hanging out of the rear passenger door, a horrific crime scene that immediately and violently contradicted the physics of a brief, defensive struggle. The official autopsy conducted by the county medical examiner dealt a catastrophic, absolutely fatal blow to Ezra's fabricated alibi, definitively revealing that Alex had sustained a staggering total of 16 incredibly deep, highly vicious stab wounds concentrated primarily across his head, neck, and upper torso. The forensic pathologist meticulously documented that this specific, catastrophic level of physical trauma was entirely, fundamentally impossible to inflict through a singular, clumsy trip onto a blade, heavily indicating a sustained, highly aggressive, and relentlessly savage overhead attack. Furthermore, the medical examiner noted the extensive presence of severe defensive lacerations deeply slicing into Alex's hands and forearms, unequivocally proving that he had fought desperately for his life against a highly motivated, entirely offensive assailant. Detectives simultaneously began aggressively dismantling the timeline of the afternoon, discovering through digital forensics that Ezra had intentionally, heavily premeditated the encounter, specifically luring Alex to that exact remote location under the false, manipulative guise of returning his personal journals. The investigation took a deeply chilling, highly sociopathic turn when medical professionals examining Ezra discovered the word "boy" crudely carved into her own forearm, an injury that forensic experts swiftly and definitively determined was entirely self-inflicted, specifically designed to artificially bolster her claims of a sadistic assault. During extensive, heavily recorded police interrogations, her initially confident demeanor systematically eroded, resulting in a continuous stream of constantly shifting, highly contradictory narratives that completely exposed her pathological need to fundamentally control the investigative direction. The rising action was characterized by this methodical, deeply satisfying extraction of the hidden truth, revealing a cold, calculating predator who systematically engineered an isolated ambush, violently slaughtered her lover, and deliberately mutilated her own flesh to falsely wear the deeply protected mantle of a victim. The absolute peak of tension and the final, catastrophic destruction of Ezra McCandless's deeply fabricated, highly manipulative reality materialized during her incredibly high-profile, deeply emotional criminal trial held in the Dunn County Courthouse. The climax of the judicial proceedings centered precisely on the devastating, entirely irrefutable presentation of her own extensive digital footprint and the highly disturbing, meticulously handwritten entries recovered from her personal journals. The defense aggressively attempted to maintain the illusion, desperately painting Ezra as a deeply traumatized, highly vulnerable survivor of horrific gender-based violence who merely acted in an extreme state of biological self-preservation. However, the prosecution systematically, entirely obliterated this deeply offensive facade by introducing a massive volume of damning text messages and obsessive journal entries that clearly documented her escalating psychological instability and a terrifying, highly calculated premeditation to violently eliminate Alex from her life. The final, absolute crushing blow was delivered by the forensic pathologists, who expertly utilized advanced biomechanical analysis and blood spatter physics to unequivocally demonstrate to the completely silent jury that the specific angle, exceptional depth, and sheer multitude of the fatal stab wounds required a massive, continuous exertion of offensive force. This objective, scientifically grounded testimony completely destroyed the defense's desperately fragile theory of a chaotic, accidental plunge onto a stationary knife, definitively proving that the cold laws of physics simply did not support her highly theatrical, deeply rehearsed version of events. When Ezra finally took the witness stand in a desperate, heavily delusional attempt to save herself, her performance devolved into a highly combative, deeply theatrical display of manufactured tears that sharply contrasted with the cold, undeniable brutality etched into the autopsy photographs. The jury was confronted with the ultimate, entirely terrifying embodiment of extreme, highly lethal narcissism, recognizing that she had not only coldly executed a gentleman, but had actively, sociopathically attempted to weaponize the legitimate language of domestic abuse survival to completely mask a highly calculated assassination. This climax represented the total, irreversible exposure of a deeply dangerous manipulator, permanently stripping away the carefully constructed mask of the tearful, victimized young woman to reveal a highly calculating, fundamentally remorseless murderer who viewed human life as entirely expendable. Faced with the entirely overwhelming, completely cohesive mountain of forensic pathology, the undeniably devastating physical evidence from the crime scene, and her own deeply incriminating written confessions, the Wisconsin jury swiftly and decisively delivered a unanimous verdict of guilty, officially convicting Ezra McCandless of first-degree intentional homicide. The presiding judge, fiercely and publicly condemning the sheer, highly calculated brutality, the extreme sociopathic narcissism, and the profoundly disturbing lack of genuine remorse displayed throughout the entirety of the legal proceedings, handed down a mandatory sentence of life in a maximum security state penitentiary. This severe judicial mandate permanently neutralized her highly lethal threat to society, completely ensuring that she could no longer utilize her deeply ingrained manipulative tactics to draw vulnerable individuals into her highly toxic, deeply fatal psychological orbit. Alex Woodworth's incredibly tragic, entirely preventable death remains a profound, heartbreaking testament within the judicial system to the extreme, terrifying lengths a deeply disturbed individual will go to orchestrate a fatal encounter and subsequently construct an elaborate, highly offensive illusion of victimhood. The successful, highly aggressive prosecution effectively demonstrated that even the most elaborate, highly publicized theatrical displays of manufactured trauma cannot permanently obscure the objective, immovable realities of forensic science and the silent, undeniable testimony of the deceased victims. As we decisively leave the muddy, deeply tragic isolation of the Wisconsin dirt road, completely moving away from a catastrophic fatal attraction heavily disguised as an act of self-defense, we must now dramatically shift our focus to the final, incredibly disturbing case of our investigation. Transitioning from a highly premeditated, violent ambush between secret lovers to a completely chaotic, deeply heartbreaking betrayal within the supposedly safe confines of a blended family household, we arrive at a tragedy that shocked the entire nation. We will now meticulously analyze the deeply disturbing reality of a stepmother who desperately attempted to completely erase a young boy from existence, hiding behind a bizarre, ever-changing labyrinth of lies that began with a fundamentally absurd claim of a catastrophic construction accident. In the sprawling, picturesque suburban neighborhoods of Colorado Springs, the blended Stauch family presented a carefully curated image of domestic stability and patriotic duty. Heavily anchored by Albert Stauch's dedicated service as an active duty member of the United States National Guard. During his frequent, extended military deployments, the day-to-day responsibilities of managing the household and raising his children fell entirely onto the shoulders of his wife, Letitia Stauch, a woman who outwardly projected the persona of a capable, loving stepmother. However, beneath this highly sanitized, heavily manufactured public facade existed a deeply toxic, profoundly unstable psychological reality governed by Letitia's deeply ingrained, pathological need for attention and her simmering, irrational resentment toward her 11-year-old stepson Gannon. Gannon was universally described by his teachers, friends, and biological family as a bright, endlessly energetic, and deeply compassionate young boy whose innocence stood in stark, tragic contrast to the dark, highly volatile temperament of the woman tasked with his care. The absolute reality of Letitia's existence was defined by a massive, heavily documented history of professional instability, chronic fabrication, and a terrifying capacity for emotional manipulation that she expertly kept hidden from her husband while he was stationed thousands of miles away. Within the supposedly safe, insulated walls of their multi-level home, a deeply dangerous power dynamic was actively festering, placing a vulnerable child under the absolute, unchecked authority of a deeply disturbed individual who viewed him not as a son, but as a severe burden and an obstacle to her own desires. The mundane routines of their daily life, characterized by school drop-offs, neighborhood playdates, and weekend chores, offered absolutely no external indicators of the horrific, intimate violence that was secretly brewing within the heavily carpeted confines of Gannon's bedroom. Understanding the sheer depth of this calculated, psychopathic deception within the domestic sphere is absolutely crucial, as it clearly establishes Letitia not as a stressed caregiver who experienced a sudden, tragic lapse in judgment, but as a cold, highly methodical predator who ultimately recognized an opportunity to permanently erase her stepson while her husband was actively serving their country. The quiet, snow-dusted streets of their Colorado subdivision merely provided a highly deceptive, tranquil staging ground for a woman whose profound narcissistic rage was destined to violently rupture the illusion of their perfect military family. This grim, underlying exposition definitively sets the stage for a deeply disturbing, highly complex investigation that would soon captivate the entire nation, revealing the terrifying lengths a pathological liar will go to conceal an unthinkable, deeply intimate execution. The terrifying, violent rupture of this domestic illusion occurred on the freezing afternoon of January 27, 2020, when Letitia Stauch initiated a highly performative, deeply chaotic call to the El Paso County Sheriff's Office, officially reporting 11-year-old Gannon as a runaway. According to the initial, breathlessly delivered narrative she provided to the emergency dispatchers and the rapidly arriving patrol officers, Gannon had simply wandered off to a neighborhood friend's house earlier in the afternoon and had inexplicably failed to return before dusk. This supposed routine disappearance instantly mobilized a massive, highly coordinated community search effort, drawing hundreds of desperate, freezing volunteers, specialized canine units, and seasoned detectives to actively scour the winding suburban streets and the expansive, heavily wooded foothills surrounding the subdivision. However, almost immediately, seasoned homicide investigators noted glaring, deeply troubling inconsistencies in Letitia's highly theatrical emotional displays, observing a caregiver who appeared completely incapable of maintaining a cohesive timeline of the afternoon in question. As the frantic hours stretched into agonizing days, with absolutely no sign of the young boy, Letitia's foundational narrative of a simple runaway rapidly and violently mutated into a chaotic, profoundly absurd labyrinth of ever-changing, completely fabricated alibis. She aggressively shifted her story from a voluntary disappearance to a bizarre claim that Gannon had suffered a severe, bloody accident while working with sharp tools in the garage, and subsequently pivoted to an entirely fabricated, highly offensive narrative involving a violent abduction by a phantom Hispanic construction worker she conveniently named Edgardo. This highly public, continuously shifting declaration served as the definitive, undeniable point of no return, instantly transforming a standard missing child protocol into a massive, heavily scrutinized criminal investigation centered entirely on the stepmother's erratic, deeply suspicious behavior. The inciting incident was not merely the tragic realization that a child was gone, but the immediate, highly calculated deployment of Letitia's fabricated reality, a terrifying illusion specifically designed to weaponize the sheer chaos of a missing person search, to completely mask a brutal domestic homicide. This fundamental, deeply disturbing disconnect between the desperate, freezing volunteers searching the snowy fields and the highly manipulative, constantly lying stepmother inside the warm house laid the immediate groundwork for an investigation that would soon expose a monster operating in plain sight. As the intense, highly coordinated police investigation rapidly transitioned from a frantic neighborhood search to a meticulous, forensic examination of the surviving household, Letitia's completely fabricated reality began to spectacularly disintegrate under the crushing, undeniable weight of modern scientific inquiry. Crime scene technicians executing a comprehensive search warrant on the Stotch residence utilized advanced chemical reagents to discover massive, highly damning traces of human blood thoroughly soaked into the mattress, carpets, and walls of Gannon's bedroom, unequivocally proving that a horrific, highly violent event had occurred entirely within the home. The investigation took a highly chilling, technologically indisputable turn when detectives secured crucial surveillance footage from a neighbor's residential security camera, which definitively captured Letitia and Gannon entering her pickup truck on the morning of his disappearance, but terrifyingly documented Letitia returning home hours later completely alone. Recognizing that the impenetrable net of objective forensic evidence was rapidly closing around her, Letitia engaged in a highly bizarre, profoundly self-destructive media strategy, inviting a local television news crew to interview her, while she inexplicably stood with her back completely turned to the camera. During this disastrous, highly defensive broadcast, she aggressively rambled through her fabricated alibis, bizarrely complaining about the police scrutiny and attempting to portray herself as the ultimate victim of an unfair investigation, entirely failing to express any genuine concern for her missing stepson. The rising action was heavily characterized by her increasingly frantic, highly erratic attempts to completely evade law enforcement, culminating in a sudden, desperate cross-country flight where she abandoned Colorado and drove all the way to South Carolina in a doomed effort to escape the inevitable arrest. During this bizarre journey, investigators meticulously tracked her digital footprint and her rental vehicles, uncovering a terrifying, heavily premeditated trail of deceit where she continuously purchased heavy-duty cleaning supplies and large, hard-shelled suitcases to actively conceal her horrific crime. When the FBI and local task forces finally cornered and formally arrested her in Myrtle Beach, she continued to aggressively spin her web of lies, incredibly attempting to orchestrate a fake prison escape and violently assaulting a transporting deputy in a sheer display of untamed, narcissistic rage. The gradual, systematic accumulation of the undeniable blood evidence, combined with the completely unassailable video footage and her own highly documented, sociopathic behavior, entirely dismantled the illusion of the grieving stepmother, exposing a highly dangerous predator desperately running out of places to hide. The absolute peak of tension and the most deeply horrifying, emotionally devastating resolution to the frantic search materialized far beyond the borders of Colorado, specifically landing in the humid, remote expanses of Pace, Florida in late March 2020. A routine bridge inspector, completely unassociated with the massive criminal investigation, made a highly disturbing, gruesome discovery when he located a discarded, heavily damaged suitcase wedged beneath the structural pilings of an overpass bridging a local river. The Florida authorities rapidly secured the highly compromised scene, and upon carefully opening the luggage, they made the heartbreaking, entirely undeniable confirmation that the violently discarded remains belonged to 11-year-old Gannon Stotch, bringing a grim, horrific finality to the 2-month ordeal. The subsequent official autopsy conducted by the Florida medical examiner dealt a catastrophic, absolutely fatal blow to any lingering, desperate theories of a tragic household accident, revealing a sheer, unimaginable level of savage, highly calculated overkill. The forensic pathologists meticulously documented that Gannon had endured severe blunt force trauma to his skull, suffered 18 distinct, incredibly vicious stab wounds across his arms and torso indicating a desperate fight for survival, and was ultimately executed via a close-range gunshot directly to the head. This highly objective, scientifically grounded medical testimony completely destroyed Letitia's vast array of fabricated narratives, definitively proving beyond any shadow of a doubt that the child was brutally, relentlessly hunted and slaughtered by his stepmother before being stuffed into a suitcase and driven across the country. During the highly anticipated, deeply emotional criminal trial, Letitia's defense team desperately attempted a final, highly complex maneuver by pleading not guilty by reason of insanity, presenting a profoundly absurd narrative claiming she suffered from a sudden, violent psychotic break triggered by an alternate personality she named Maria. However, the prosecution systematically, entirely obliterated this deeply offensive psychological facade by introducing highly specialized forensic psychiatrists who unequivocally diagnosed her not as legally insane, but as a highly manipulative, fully conscious malingerer who meticulously planned the execution and the subsequent elaborate cover-up. This climax represented the total, irreversible exposure of a deeply parasitic, highly dangerous manipulator, permanently stripping away the carefully constructed mask of insanity to reveal a cold, highly calculating murderer who viewed absolute brutality as a completely acceptable solution to her domestic frustrations. Faced with the entirely overwhelming, completely cohesive mountain of forensic pathology, the undeniably devastating physical evidence of the cross-country transport, and the transparent absurdity of her fabricated psychological defenses, the Colorado jury swiftly and decisively delivered a unanimous verdict of guilty on all major charges, officially convicting Letitia Stauch of first-degree murder. The presiding judge, fiercely and publicly condemning the sheer, highly calculated brutality, the extreme sociopathic narcissism, and the profoundly disturbing lack of genuine remorse displayed throughout the entirety of the legal proceedings, handed down dual consecutive life sentences without the absolute possibility of parole. This incredibly severe judicial mandate permanently neutralized her highly lethal threat to society, ensuring that the deeply manipulative woman who transported her stepson's remains across multiple state lines would spend the entirety of her natural life secured behind the impenetrable walls of a maximum security state penitentiary. While the trial's definitive conclusion provided a profound, deeply necessary measure of legal justice and finality for Albert Stauch, Gannon's biological mother, and the fiercely dedicated investigators, the sheer unimaginable cruelty of the crime left an indelible, highly traumatic scar on the local community and the nation at large. Gannon's incredibly tragic, entirely preventable death remains a profound, heartbreaking testament within the judicial system to the extreme, terrifying lengths a deeply disturbed, pathologically lying individual will go to completely eradicate a vulnerable dependent. The successful, highly aggressive prosecution effectively demonstrated that even the most elaborate, highly publicized, and geographically vast attempts to conceal a domestic execution cannot permanently obscure the objective, immovable realities of forensic science and the silent, undeniable physical testimony of the deceased victims. The unyielding permanence of the blood evidence and the absolute dedication of the inter-agency task forces ultimately ensured that the dark, isolated waters of a Florida river could not permanently swallow the brutal reality of her actions. As we step back from this final, devastating descent into the darkest corners of domestic betrayal, we must finally pull the lens back to examine the overarching, terrifying commonalities that unite these 10 horrific investigations. We are left to confront the profound, unsettling reality that the most dangerous predators do not lurk in the shadows, but sit comfortably across the dinner table, armed with a terrifying capacity for deception and a chilling willingness to swear that their victims simply slipped and fell. While these killers genuinely believe their calculated deceptions could permanently bury the truth, the silent, unyielding laws of forensic science will always speak louder than a fabricated alibi. Thank you for watching, and as you safely lock your doors tonight, you are left to ponder one final, terrifying question: how well do you truly know the person sleeping right beside you?